They were like people I had never seen before. "Congrats on marrying my brother. Your dress is cute, but don't you think mine looks better?" my sister-in-law said. "Oh, saying that will make the bride feel bad," she continued, pretending to joke. It was supposed to be my happiest day, but in the bridal dressing room, I was left speechless by my sister-in-law and mother-in-law's rude comments. They spoke with an arrogant tone, and I was shocked. My sister-in-law's outfit was unbelievable. She wore a dress so white it could compete with any bride's dress. It had a slit showing off her legs, and she wrapped fur around her off-the-shoulder top. My mother-in-law looked at her daughter with admiration, while my husband stared at his family coldly. I never thought I'd be treated so badly on my wedding day. It was too much to handle. Looking back, it's no wonder my sister-in-law's matchmaking efforts ended in failure with behavior like that, even at someone else's wedding. My name is Annaya. I was born in a coastal town and grew up in a regular family. When I went to a state university, I stayed with my maternal grandmother, who lived nearby. Living with grandma, who had always pampered me, was a dream come true. Her well-kept house had a mix of Western and traditional styles, and it had a warm, nostalgic atmosphere. I loved sitting on the balcony, overlooking the small garden, chatting with grandma while eating seasonal fruits. Even after I got a job, I stayed there. When grandma got sick, I took care of the house, hoping she'd come back, but that wish never came true. When she could no longer live on her own, she moved to a care home in my hometown. "I want to take care of grandma," I said, but she smiled and told me, "You've done enough, Annaya. I want you to find happiness." After grandma passed away, I married Jesse, who had always been there for me. Now we live in the house filled with grandma's memories, but what should have been a peaceful newlywed life is constantly interrupted by those two women. "How did someone as plain-looking and skinny as you marry my brother?" my sister-in-law once asked me. One day, my mother-in-law asked me to make lunch for my sister-in-law while she went to a neighborhood meeting. Instead of being thankful, my sister-in-law greeted me with sarcasm. I wanted to leave, but I knew they would just come to my house if I did. "Ask your brother," my sister-in-law said, satisfied with her own conclusion. "Well, maybe you two are a good match since he's not that great either." She then gulped down the curry I made. She probably thinks that eating small bites in front of men makes her more attractive. My sister-in-law may seem mean, but what's truly scary is that she doesn't even realize how rude she is. She looks down on everyone, including me and her own brother, without a second thought. It's exhausting. My mother-in-law, who raised her, is no better. Instead of disliking me, my mother-in-law focuses on making her daughter look good by criticizing me and ordering me around. That's why she calls me for these kinds of tasks. If I ignored my sister-in-law, my mother-in-law would either call me nonstop or ring my doorbell endlessly. It was like living in a nightmare. My mother-in-law always said her daughter was the most important person in her life and never really cared about her son, my husband. My husband insists he was never mistreated, but he also says he was never given much attention. His father went on a work trip 10 years ago and never came back. Even after retiring, he still sends money for living expenses. So it seems neither my mother-in-law nor sister-in-law care about him. My husband tries to talk to them about their behavior, but they never listen. To them, he's just someone else to look down on. Watching my husband suffer hurt more than my own struggles, and I often gave in to my mother-in-law's demands, which was a mistake. As a result, both of them became more unbearable, and the stress began to affect our marriage. We knew we couldn't continue like this. Determined, my husband and I decided to come up with a plan. Just as we were about to put it into action, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law showed up unexpectedly at our house on a hot summer day. My husband was at work, so I reluctantly greeted them. "Hello, sister-in-law, what brings you here?" I asked. "Just because we're your cute sister-in-law and mother-in-law doesn't mean we need a reason to visit. You should fix that stingy attitude. It's hot outside. Let us in." "You're so inconsiderate," she replied. I really didn't want to let them into grandma's house, but to avoid a scene, I had no choice. I served them coffee and some cookies I had baked the day before. "No cake?" they asked. "I'm sorry, you came unexpectedly," I explained. "Well, it's okay. Your cooking is decent, even if a bit plain," they said. I was surprised to hear them compliment me, but it felt more unsettling than pleasant. "The house is old, but it's spacious. It's passable," they remarked. To me, grandma's house was perfect. Then, out of nowhere, my mother-in-law announced, my sister-in-law, is getting married." I was stunned for a moment, but considering how she always bragged about her body and bold approach with men, it wasn't entirely shocking. It seemed to work on gullible guys or those looking for some fun. "Is it the guy you had an affair with?" I asked. remembering a man she once mentioned. It wasn't an affair, we just met at the wrong time. It's true love, she said, trying to justify it. But no, not him. The one who recently approached you, I continued. I just noticed him staring at me and went up to him first. But no, not him either, she replied. Then who? I asked. Elle met him at a speed dating event. He's the son of a wealthy man, my mother-in-law announced proudly. That's right. I'm having a shotgun wedding with a rich guy. Good for me. Unlike your brother who married someone like you, my sister-in-law said with a smirk, adding that she was already pregnant. She didn't miss the chance to insult me. The speed dating event had been about 3 months ago, and she likely charmed an unsuspecting man. I felt sorry for him and his family. Did you break up with the other guys? I asked. Not yet. They all love me so much. I can't bear to tell them, she said smugly, but it's inevitable. I'm just too lovable, she boasted. What really drove her, though, was money. I had a feeling this was the case, but I still wondered if the child was even from that wealthy man. Then they revealed their true motive. We want to use this house for the pre-wedding family introduction. I was so disgusted that I immediately said, no way. They glared at me, and to avoid an argument, I tried to smooth things over. I think the groom's family would want to see the bride's real home. Besides, our place is small and a bit messy, I explained. Then clean it up and stop smoking inside, my sister-in-law snapped. But won't they find it strange to come to the bride's brother's house? I asked. You're not getting it, she replied. We'll just say, this is my family's home. What if they find out the truth? I pushed. As long as you and your husband stay quiet, it'll be fine. Once we're married, he's mine, and I'm pregnant, so it's not that simple, she said. Why don't you just make this house belong to mom and dad? She suggested. Her outrageous idea left me speechless. Oh, what a great idea. This house is old, but we'll take it, she added. This is my grandma's house. It's not just my decision, I said, shocked. Don't you know? Once you're married, everything belongs to the husband's family, my sister-in-law retorted. I've never heard of such a rule, I replied, confused. Well, learn it now. What's yours is ours, she said confidently. So next Sunday, we'll bring the fiancé and his family. Oh, and make a fancy meal. We'll tell them Elle made it, and change the curtains to match Elle's style, she added. They left after dumping all their demands on me, leaving me seething with anger and a pile of dirty dishes. That night, my husband, feeling guilty, said, I'm sorry, we won't let them use the house. Of course not, but even if we refuse, they'll just show up anyway. Maybe we should move up our plan, I suggested. I could handle them bullying me, but I couldn't stand them disrespecting grandma's house. We'll get back at them for everything, so brace yourself, my husband said, determined. The next day, I made several phone calls. Despite the last-minute change, everyone was understanding, and I felt grateful. Once everything was set, I called my mother-in-law. Mother-in-law, I want Elle's wedding to be a success. Can we have a bit more time? We're thinking of remodeling the house to make it more suitable for the couple, I said, playing along. Annaya, I misunderstood you. You're such a good person, she said, thinking I was on their side. But we have wedding preparations to deal with, she added, still focused on their plans. Please hurry up, my mother-in-law said. I understand. We'll be ready in 3 weeks. In the meantime, why don't you start looking for a wedding venue? I suggested. You're so thoughtful, it's almost scary. But yes, we'll leave the introduction to you and focus on the wedding, she replied. It felt like our first pleasant conversation, and probably the last. They had no idea what was coming and wouldn't visit the house until the big day. My husband and I had a tight deadline, but we worked non-stop, even sacrificing sleep. We knew it was for our future. 3 weeks later, the day my mother-in-law had set for the family introduction finally arrived. My husband and I anxiously waited for her call. I could already imagine the fury on her face. At exactly 10 a.m., my phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. Annaya, what have you done? She screamed, her voice hysterical. I thought you'd appreciate it. I prepared the perfect vacant land and a meal for you and Elle. I calmly replied. What have you done? She screamed again, but her words were hard to understand. The place where she had taken her fiancé's family, claiming it was her home, was no longer grandma's house. I had arranged for a new home and meal, but they clearly weren't happy. I realized my mother-in-law wanted me to explain what was going on. I responded sweetly. I'm sorry if I upset you. Could you put me on speaker so the groom's mother can hear? The shouting stopped, and a polite voice came on the line. Are you Aaron's mother? I asked. It seems there's been some misunderstanding. I pretended to confuse the groom with several men my sister-in-law had been involved with. Oh, is it Ivan or Phil? I listed more names. Annaya, stop it. My mother-in-law shrieked louder than ever before. Then the call abruptly ended. I could imagine them in the middle of a huge argument. That felt good, I said with a smile. My husband, who had listened to the whole conversation, looked at me apologetically. I'm sorry for making you do that. I should have handled it, he said. No, remember I told you I wanted to get back at them for what they did to Grandma's house. I reminded him. Grandma always wanted me to be happy. I love that house, but you are more important to me. In truth, my mother, Grandma's heir, had already planned to demolish the house. It wasn't earthquake resistant, and maintaining such an old place was difficult. I had insisted on staying because I loved it, but after dealing with my in-laws, I changed my mind. I didn't want them to ruin Grandma's house, but I also didn't want to leave my husband. So, I decided to say goodbye to the house with fond memories. That's why I asked my husband to find a new job, and we prepared to move back to my hometown. We just sped up our plans. I had Grandma's house demolished and built a small dog house in the middle of the vacant lot, with a tag that read L. It was designed like a log cabin, and we even went slightly over budget for it. I filled a small dish with the most expensive dog food from the pet store. Everything was set. Grandma liked you. She wouldn't want us to break up because of that house. Annaya, I promise I won't waste this chance you've given me, my husband said earnestly. I made the decision because I believed in him. A year and a half has passed since then. After we moved to my hometown, my husband, who was initially a bit unsure about the tough fisherman neighbors, is now more loved by them than I am. The coastal town's breeze and seafood-rich dishes seem to suit him well. His once pale complexion has completely changed. Seeing him happily enjoy grilled salmon for dinner fills me with peace and contentment. Did you get any emails today? I asked one evening. No, nothing recently. They're probably too busy, he replied. We haven't been in touch with my mother-in-law and sister-in-law since the incident. My husband's phone is the only connection we have with them. We later heard about the doghouse fiasco from a neighbor who had been close to Grandma. Apparently, when my mother-in-law and sister-in-law brought the fiancé's family to see what they claimed was their home, they found nothing but the demolished lot with the little doghouse and a dish filled with expensive dog food. The luxurious smell from the food must have added to their embarrassment. The two were furious, accusing me of harassing them, but that wasn't the worst part. After hearing hints about my sister-in-law's questionable taste in men during a phone call, the fiancé's family confronted her. She couldn't give them any clear answers, so they hired a private detective. The investigation revealed all of her lies and past relationships. This led to a DNA test for the unborn child, and it was confirmed that the baby wasn't the wealthy man's. Naturally, the engagement was called off. The baby's real father turned out to be another man she had been seeing. Luckily for her, he was thrilled to have a child with her, and the two ended up getting married. However, the man's mother, who adored her son, wasn't happy about him marrying an older woman with a questionable past. Furious, she insisted that they live together. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law, upset that her daughter had been taken, rented an apartment near the newlyweds, and the two mothers seemed to clash daily. Sister-in-law, who had dreamed of marrying rich and living a luxurious life, now seems worn out. She's constantly bullied by her mother-in-law and has to juggle household chores and childcare. But there is a bright side, her husband adores their baby, so it's really up to them to manage their life. One day, my husband's phone rings. Oh, it's an invitation for drinks from my dad, he says. His father has really warmed up to him. I enjoy his stories, and my mother-in-law always prepares my favorite dishes, he added. I realize now that my own mother never cared about my favorite things. This is what family feels like, he murmured. I reassured him. Don't worry, you'll be the kind of parent who knows all their child's favorites. As I gently rubbed my growing belly, he smiled warmly. I feel like we can make that happen in this home, he said, looking up at the beautiful caramel-colored beam on the ceiling. That beam came from Grandma's house when we demolished it, and we had it incorporated into our new home as a reminder of her. It was my husband's idea to keep the beam, while I had just wanted to tear everything down. That's why I chose a future with him. Let's make this house as wonderful as Grandma's, I said. Yes, absolutely, he agreed. In our small house, in this peaceful coastal town where you can hear the sound of the waves, we are building our happiness.
Erin heard the front door open but feigned sleep. Usually she would meet her husband when he returned from his night shift, and he appreciated it, despite pretending to be annoyed. "You could have slept in," Glenn would say, feigning irritation. "It's so early. Can't I make tea, or heat up my meal by myself?" Erin would just shrug, taking pleasure in welcoming her husband home. Rising an hour earlier was a small sacrifice for the man she loved. But this time she had a different plan. When she heard Glenn peek into the bedroom, she continued to feign deep sleep. "Erin?" her husband called softly. She didn't respond and he left the room, attempting to close the bedroom door quietly behind him. However, it wouldn't fully close with a light touch. Erin sighed. If she got up to close it now, Glenn would know she was awake, ruining the surprise. She decided to be patient for a bit longer. Suddenly, Erin heard Glenn on the phone. She wondered who could be calling this early. "I can't come now, sweetheart. Don't you understand? I just got home." Erin was stunned. Lying on her belly, she could feel her heart pounding, the rhythm echoing through the pillow. She couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but the voice was thin and childish. "No, now I can't. I'm sorry," Glenn continued. "Let's arrange for later this afternoon or evening." He sighed. "Don't be upset, please. You know how much I love you. I'll try to come tonight, my sunshine." Apparently, the please had not worked, and the thin voice on the phone grumbled resentfully before hanging up. Glenn went to take a shower, and once Erin heard the sound of running water, she allowed herself to cry. "That's what I got after many years of marriage and 2 kids, she thought. "I believed I'd found the happiness with a loving partner by my side, except this partner gets a call from his mistress at 6 a.m, and he's explaining why he can't come over." Erin was born in a small village far away from the big metropolis. Her parents, Alberta and Graham, were overjoyed with her. She was cheerful, energetic, intelligent, and radiated positivity like a ray of sunshine. The little girl was always ready to help her mother around the house. Even from a young age, she was curious about everything, especially in the kitchen. Alberta was always worried that Erin might burn herself or accidentally break something, but it seemed as if the girl had an instinct for it, or as if someone invisible was looking out for her. By the time she reached 3rd grade, Erin could cook lunch or dinner for the entire family. Even though Alberta was a good cook herself, she admitted that Erin's dishes tasted better. Graham noticed this too. "It seems our daughter could become a great cook," Graham often said. "She might even open her own restaurant one day." But Erin hadn't thought about owning a restaurant yet. She was just interested in cooking to please her parents and grandparents. Although she had many friends in the village, she wished she had siblings. However, she was generally a happy child and grew up in a loving, strong family. Then disaster struck. Her father went with the men to cut down forest, and a tree fell on him. He was immediately rushed to the town by the men. The doctors did their best, but Graham was left paralysed from the waist down. Erin had just turned 12 years old. From that moment on, the entire burden of the household fell on Erin and her mother. They had a large household to manage: a horse, 2 cows, chickens, ducks, a dog, cats, and a vegetable garden, which was essential for survival in the village. Erin and her mother shouldered this responsibility. Milking cows, herding a horse, feeding numerous ducks and chickens, caring for her ailing father, plus her schoolwork, was undoubtedly tough for Erin. But she never complained, as she saw that her parents were even more burdened. Her mother was the sole teacher at the village primary school. Despite the small number of children, it was a significant workload for Alberta. The woman often returned home late, while Erin arrived from high school in the neighbouring town an hour before her. In that time, Erin would manage to prepare dinner, look after the livestock, and assist her father. She saw how her father, confined to a wheelchair, suffered with his helplessness. It was then that Erin decided that when she grew up, she would help her parents. so that they wouldn't have to work so hard. And when the time came, she pursued her passion for cooking by enrolling in culinary school. "How will you manage without me?" Erin asked her parents before leaving for the city. "Do not worry, daughter," Alberta reassured her. "We'll sell a horse and cows, and things will become easier. Plus, our relatives won't leave us without help. We'll manage." Erin looked at her father, who was smiling. "Go, my daughter," he said. "We believe in you. You'll open your own restaurant." Erin enjoyed studying. Student life was the most carefree and fun time of her life. Despite the lack of money and living in a 3-person dorm room, the youthfulness and the people around her easily compensated for all this. Erin and her roommates managed to do everything. They attended classes, did homework, and even went out after classes. By her second year, Erin took a part-time job as an assistant cook in a small but cosy restaurant. The chief, Mrs. Sullivan, was a kind woman around 65 years old, and she also was the owner of that restaurant. Mrs. Sullivan was immediately drawn to the young, quick, responsible, and talented girl. "You must understand," she said to Erin once, "if you continue to work here, in time you could become the head chef here." Erin smiled at such a suggestion and asked, "What about you?" Mrs. Sullivan waved her hand dismissively. "I'm not going to stand at the cooker until I'm 80. I've spent so many years in the kitchen. I will retire to Italy, savouring wine, eating pasta and admiring handsome men." Erin laughed. "Okay, I'll think about it." She enjoyed working here, especially under the guidance of Mrs. Sullivan. The culinary school taught her the correct procedures and proven technology, strictly according to the recipe. But as the experienced chef Mrs. Sullivan had her own secrets. "It's not only my way," she told Erin. "Every good chef accumulates a wealth of tricks throughout their career, and they don't share them with anyone. And don't you share yours with anyone either." The girl laughed. "But you've shared yours with me, haven't you?" Mrs. Sullivan shrugged. "You're my student, that's different. I'm going to delegate my business to you because I believe in you." When Erin already had 1 week left before her graduation party, an accident happened. She had just finished work and was heading home when she slipped on a wet floor that had just been mopped. "Erin!" the cleaner shouted in fear. "Are you okay?" Erin attempted to stand. She managed, but her left leg was in severe pain. "It's all right," she replied. "Just a bruise." Not wanting to worry the elderly cleaning lady, Erin gathered herself, stood up and limped towards the exit. However, once outside, it became clear that it was more than just a bruise. At the hospital, Erin was directed to the emergency room and asked to wait for the on-duty doctor. After a long day's work and the accident, she was exhausted. She leaned back against the cold, pale green wall and closed her eyes. "Who hurt their leg?" a man's voice rang out. Erin abruptly opened her eyes. "It's me." A tall, thin man with dark hair and a shabby haircut was staring at her. "What happened?" "I've fallen unluckily. I just slipped on a wet floor, and now my foot hurts." "I see. Let's look at your leg." He gently but confidently touched Erin's leg, causing minimal pain. "Ouch!" The girl couldn't help but cry out when the doctor's fingers touched a particularly painful spot. "I think you have a slight sprain, but let's take an X-ray to be sure. I'll drive you." "I can walk myself." Erin tried to object. "No, unfortunately you can't." The doctor put her on a gurney and took her to the X-ray room. She had her X-ray taken there, which the on-duty doctor immediately reviewed. He then reassured Erin, "Everything's fine. As I expected, it's not a fracture. Now, let's treat it." He led her to the dressing room. As Erin settled on the hospital couch, she asked anxiously, "How long will I need to stay here? I have my graduation in a week, and I really want to attend, even if I'm in a cast." The doctor smiled. "What are you graduating from?" "Culinary school." "Oh, so you're going to be a chef?" "Yes." "I love good food. Where can I get something cooked by my patient. Erin smiled as the doctor began to apply an elastic bandage. Well, I work at a nearby restaurant, Paradise Fantasy. Have you heard of it? The doctor nodded. I've been there a few times. It's good. I'll definitely stop by during your shift. I'll be waiting. Don't worry about graduation, the doctor said. You don't need hospitalization for a sprain, but I'll write you a week's sick leave. Rest your leg. You don't need a cast, but please follow my recommendations. I will, thank you. Erin stammered, realizing she didn't know the doctor's name. Dr. Glenn Vance. He answered and wrote out his recommendations. Erin left the hospital, regretting she wouldn't see him again. However, Dr. Vance surprised her by showing up at the restaurant a few weeks later. By then, Erin had recovered and was back at work. Erin, a customer asked for you, the waiter informed her, and he knows your name and surname. Erin tensed. Did he say what he wanted? No, the waiter replied. The girl sighed and walked into the hall, escorted by the waiter to a table. There she spotted a familiar doctor. Dr. Vance, she said, astonished. The man stood up and smiled. Erin, good afternoon. I told you I'd come to see you. The girl returned his smile. Well then, your dinner is on us. What would you like? Your choice, just remember, I'm very hungry after work. Okay, Erin laughed. Don't worry, we'll make sure you're well fed. I'll prepare the largest portions. Glenn enjoyed his dinner. After he finished, he called Erin over again. When do you get off work? He asked. In half an hour. May I walk you home? Or if you're not too tired, we could go for a walk. Yes, I'd like that. The evening was warm and serene. Glenn escorted her home. Erin was currently renting an apartment with a friend, not far from Paradise Fantasies, about a 20 to 30-minute walk away. How's your leg? Asked the doctor. Thank you, it's fine, replied Erin. You've cured me. The man looked embarrassed. I didn't do anything special. You just had a minor sprain. Your body healed itself, really. Don't devalue your services, Erin replied. You are an excellent traumatologist. Glenn smiled. Actually, I'm an intern in neurosurgery, but occasionally I work in the emergency room, if I am asked. That's great. Do you enjoy your job? Very much. My supervisor, Professor Whitehead, is incredibly skilled. He specializes in spinal injuries. It's a privilege to watch him operate. He literally puts people back on their feet. Seeing Erin's facial expression change, Glenn grew concerned. Did I say something upsetting? Erin shook her head. No, not at all. You tell very interesting stories. It's just because of my family. My father sustained a spinal injury when I was a teenager. He hasn't been able to walk since. I'm sorry to hear that. They continued their conversation for a while and then Glenn said, If you're willing, if you have the opportunity, could you please show me his medical records? I could show them to the professor. Yeah, I can have my mum send the papers, or I can pick them up myself when I go home. But why? Of course, I can't promise anything, but the professor sometimes treats even patients who were injured a long time ago. I can't guarantee anything, though. I understand. I'll go home this weekend and bring the documents. A couple of days later, Alberta handed the documents to her daughter. Everything is for the best, my daughter. If there is hope, thank God. If the professor says that nothing can be done, well, at least we tried. So, what's going on between you and this young doctor? Her mother suddenly asked. The girl blushed. Mum, what are you talking about? We've only met once. You like him, I can tell. He's nice, very kind and smart, but I don't want to rush things. Erin visited Glenn at the hospital. He emerged from the operating room, tired, damp and dishevelled. But when he saw her, he immediately smiled. Good afternoon, Erin. Hello, Glenn. Here are the documents, she said, holding out a folder. He quickly skimmed the statements. Erin noticed a funny wrinkle on his forehead and couldn't help but smile. I'll show these to the professor, Glenn stated. Just as I've mentioned before, I can't promise anything. I understand. How can I reach you? May I have your phone number? I'll call you myself. She gave it to him. It was nice to see you, Erin. I wish we had more time to talk, but I have to return to my patients. Erin smiled. It was good to see you too. I'll be waiting for your call. Glenn called a week later, his voice filled with anticipation. The professor is intrigued. He wants to speak with you. Can you come now? He'll be at the hospital for another 2 hours. Yes, I'll be there. The professor was a small, short, lean man in his 50s. Erin was taken aback by his energy at first sight. She knew that Professor Whitehead had just come off shift, but he looked alert, as if he had just gotten up after a long sleep. Nice to meet you, Erin, the man said, shaking her hand and smiling. Glenn's been talking about nothing but you lately. Erin glanced at the young doctor, who blushed slightly and looked away. Let's not waste any time, the professor immediately continued. Let's get down to business. He asked Erin in detail about her father, the circumstances of his injury, where and how he was examined and treated, his current capabilities, and even his mental state. Erin recounted everything she could remember. Dad is a very strong man, Erin concluded. He's mostly frustrated with his own helplessness, but he has never given up. He has always tried not to be a burden to my mother and me. I believe he's ready to seize any opportunity he gets. That's good. That's the attitude we need. Remember, however, I can't guarantee success. Erin nodded. I understand. Yes, it is critical that both you and your parents understand this clearly. Don't mistake this chance for a certainty. It's an opportunity, like a coin toss. It could go either way. If our plans don't materialize, your dad will revert to his previous state. I believe Dad would be perfectly content with that, Erin responded. Her father readily agreed, yet she could see fear and doubt flickering in his eyes. I must try it, Graham declared, squashing his doubts. It can't get any worse. If I refuse, I'll spend my life wondering if things could have been different. Soon he was placed in the hospital. Alberta was allowed to be with her husband, so Erin visited them either before or after her work shift, or on her days off. Each visit she saw Glenn. He updated her on the preparation progress. The professor had ordered several tests and was very pleased with the results. The operation is scheduled for tomorrow, Glenn finally told Erin, but you can only see your father a few days later. He'll be under observation in the ICU initially. I'm incredibly worried, Erin expressed. As if I'm the one who will be operated on. I'm nervous too, Glenn confessed. The professor asked me to assist him. The operation was a success. Erin found out from her mother, who called her in tears. Why are you crying if everything is fine? Erin affectionately asked her. I can't believe it really happened, exhaled Alberta. The professor mentioned a long rehabilitation period and all that, but I'm ready for it, so is Graham. We've been given a chance, and we're going to make the most of it. Just a few weeks later, Erin and Alberta were tearfully hugging each other, watching her father wiggle his toes. Gradually he began to stand, then to walk with the assistance of a walker, leaning on the wall or his wife's hand, and eventually on his own. Before discharge, the professor personally prescribed a plan of further rehabilitation. Graham promised to follow them carefully. Well, that's it, said Glenn sadly, as he and Erin parted ways outside the hospital. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for everything, she replied. I thank God for meeting you. Will I see you again? Come to my restaurant, Erin answered and blushed. What about meeting at an off-duty location? The girl laughed. Okay, that can be arranged too. That's how Erin's relationship with Glenn began. They had a lot in common. Both had moved to the city from small villages, found jobs they loved, and envisioned their futures there. A year had passed. Glenn was completing his internship, and Erin was learning to manage a restaurant. Although Mrs. Sullivan wasn't ready to retire as the head chef, she gradually started delegating responsibilities to Erin. Previously, she handled food purchasing, staff supervision, and distribution of tasks among the junior cooks, while Erin observed. Now, Erin had to learn to make important decisions, manage other employees, and be firm. If needed, she had to assertively communicate any issues and ensure the responsible subordinate addressed them. One day, while dining at a restaurant, to Erin's complete surprise, Glenn proposed to her. "It's only going to get harder from here," he said. "The professor took me in his team, so I need to gain as much practical experience as I can. I'll attend all surgeries, even those patients who aren't mine. Plus, I'll be often on duty at the hospital." Erin nodded. "I understand your worries. You know, I'm also still adjusting to the idea of being the future head chef." "But your current head chef, Mrs. Sullivan, isn't planning to leave anytime soon, is she?" "Not for the next few years, no." "Then we should definitely get married now." Their wedding was modest. Apart from Erin and Glenn's parents, Professor Whitehead, Mrs. Sullivan, some colleagues from work, friends and classmates. Erin's father had fully recovered by then, and he and Alberta spent much of the wedding thanking Professor Whitehead. Observing everyone around her, Erin realised that she was genuinely happy with her small wedding. All her loved ones were present, and most importantly, she was beside her beloved, with whom she shared a deep understanding. Their eldest son, Ron, was born a year after the wedding. Initially, Erin hadn't intended for things to happen so quickly, but then she discovered she was pregnant. Her mother comforted her. "I understand that you're afraid of losing your job," said Alberta, "but trust me, your maternity leave will fly by. At work you're valued and appreciated for your talent. Above all, they'll recognise you as a responsible, decent and kind person, which is truly rare. And I'm sure there won't be any problem with Mrs. Sullivan." And Erin's mother was right. Mrs. Sullivan took the news of Erin's pregnancy in her stride. "I understand it's a common occurrence," the chief smiled. "Don't worry, there's no one better than you. Your position will always be here for you, and besides, I plan to work a little more." As for Glenn, he was simply overjoyed. The next day, he brought his wife 2 bouquets of flowers. "One for me, the other from Professor Whitehead," Glenn explained. "He's also thrilled for us." Erin worked until the 8th month. She might have even agreed to give birth in her own kitchen if her husband hadn't been so insistent. "You're surrounded by high temperatures, strong odours, boiling liquids and other dangers in there. Please don't get me worried during my operations by imagining my pregnant wife is in the midst of all these horrors." As a result, Erin found herself at home for the first time in years, with very little work to do. Living in a city apartment differs from a village. There were no cows to milk or chickens to feed. Their home was equipped with all the necessary modern conveniences. So Erin spent her time reading books, taking walks in the park for fresh air, and inventing creative meals for her husband. Sometimes, if she were in the mood, she would cook for the entire emergency room. Glenn's colleagues eagerly awaited his arrival with a container or box filled with Erin's delicious meal. The birth went smoothly. Naturally, Erin gave birth in the same hospital where her husband worked, and everyone knew she was Glenn's wife. The head of the department personally oversaw Erin, and she felt embarrassed by all the attention. The usual life of a young mother started for Erin. Glenn tried to help, but he was short on time due to his work demands. He was just starting to perform some operations independently, and he had to fully commit himself there. Erin understood this and did not express her fatigue to Glenn. Thankfully, she had help. Her parents, either together or separately, often visited and stayed for a few days. Glenn's parents also helped, but less frequently. Things got easier when Ron started to attend kindergarten. Erin was anxious about how her son would manage without her, but also realised her own need for a break from staying at home. Returning to work felt terrifying. She worried it might take time to adjust back to work, but her skills hadn't disappeared. By the end of her first day back, Erin felt as confident as if she hadn't left at all. "I was sure that your hand would remember everything," Mrs. Sullivan said cheerfully. "How do you like your first day of work?" Erin smiled. "Interesting. So many people around. No one even once screamed, or asked to pee, or turn on a cartoon." Mrs. Sullivan laughed. "Welcome to the adult world." Balancing work and childcare was certainly challenging. Ron was in a period of adaptation, and he was often ill. This meant Erin had to take time off work. However, Mrs. Sullivan was patient. She had already firmly decided that she would pass the kitchen management only to Erin, and was ready to wait. However, when Ron was 3 years old, Erin found out she was pregnant again. "Well, this time will be a daughter," her husband exclaimed happily, but he was wrong. Their youngest son Frank was born. The second time was both harder and easier. Easier because Erin knew what to expect, and harder because now she had 2 children, and her husband was, as usual, often away for work. Erin was proud of her husband, a young but highly respected neurosurgeon. She believed that in time things would change. In a few years, he might become a famous surgeon, maybe even a department head or a professor. Then he probably would have more time for his family. When Frank turned 1.5, Erin enrolled him in kindergarten and returned to work. Mrs. Sullivan immediately asked her, "I hope you're not planning a 3rd pregnancy?" Erin laughed and replied, "No, we're content. Of course, I'd prefer a daughter, but," she quickly added, seeing her boss's disapproval, "that's not now, for sure. Right now I want to work. I miss it badly." Like her husband, Erin was eager to immerse herself in work, but she couldn't ignore her duties as a mother. Eventually they hired a nanny who would pick up the children from kindergarten and care for them until Erin returned from work. Erin considered herself the happiest woman in the world. She had a loving husband, wonderful children, and a job she was passionate about. However, her happiness was soon marred by unsettling suspicions planted by her co-worker. One day Madeline, the waiter, was behaving unusually, and at the end of the shift she seemed on the brink of tears. Erin remembered that she and Madeline lived nearby, so after their shift ended she offered her a lift, which she accepted. On the drive, Madeline began to sob and share her story without any prompting. "We've been together for 3 years, she exclaimed. "He proposed, and we were supposed to get married in 3 months. Then I found out about his infidelity." Erin tried to remain composed, asking, "What exactly did you find out, Madeline?" "That he's been cheating on me almost from the start," Madeline cried, "with nurses from his department." Taken aback, Erin asked, "So, your boyfriend is a doctor?" Madeline nodded, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. "Yes, he's a general practitioner." "And how did you find out about his cheating? Did he tell you himself about it?" "Of course no. I've had suspicions for a long time." Erin parked the car near Madeline's house. However, the young woman seemed oblivious to her surroundings, lost in her sorrow. "I realized later, when I started remembering everything, that it all began a long time ago. When we started dating, he had just begun his residency and was often on duty. He said he needed the experience. If I'd known what kind of experience he was getting." "But it's really true," Erin tried to object. She wanted to add that her husband was also a doctor, and she knew what it was like not to see him for weeks due to work, but she remained silent. Madeline continued, "I believed him. I was proud, bragging to everyone that my boyfriend was a doctor. Sure, I noticed things occasionally. The smell of women's perfume on his clothes, a scratch on his back or collarbone, a midnight text." Erin asked hoarsely, "Did you ask him about it?" "Of course, but he had an excuse for everything. The perfume, they change in a common locker room. The scratches. A drunken man attacked him at the emergency room. And the texts. It's from work. Madeline, who had calmed down, started crying again. Maybe that's what happened, Erin asked Madeline cautiously. I was so sure in his decency. I believed everything for the first 2 years. Then I was told by some good people. The girl sobbed. Who were these people? Erin asked. Madeline stopped crying and wiped her face with a handkerchief. Her face was red and swollen now, and her once beautiful eyes were now narrowed to 2 small slits. One of them was the woman he was trying to make his next mistress. She had just started working as a nurse in his department. At first, she thought he was nice and kind. He offered her tea during one of their night shifts together. She accepted, and then he began to pester her. She became scared and ran away. She told the head nurse everything. And what did she do? Erin asked. She said everyone knew their young doctor didn't miss a skirt, and if you told him you didn't want to, he wouldn't bother any more. Erin could only gasp in response. And that girl turned out to be principled, Madeline said. She found me on social media, suggested we meet and told me everything. I didn't want to believe her, of course, but I spoke to Paul yesterday evening. He denied it initially, but his face gave him away. Then he confessed. I've been mulling what to do over all shift. By the way, why didn't you take the day off? I didn't want to be alone. I thought work would distract me, but it hasn't. Erin gently took Madeline's hand. You should take a few days off. Just make sure you're not alone. Stay with a friend, your mum or your sister. Madeline nodded. But I still don't know what to do about him. I told him we're breaking up, but I can't stop thinking about our 3 years together, and that if I hadn't discovered this, I could have married him, and perhaps lived happily with him for the rest of my life. But you did find out, and you can hardly pretend it didn't happen. I couldn't, of course. What would you do in my place? Madeline asked Erin, who hadn't expected this question at all. I don't know, she admitted honestly. Madeline sighed. I'm sorry, I'm so embarrassed. I have spoken too openly with you. You've been sitting here with me for half an hour, and you have to go home to your husband and children. Erin hugged her. It's nothing, Madeline. Everything will be all right. Don't worry about a man who's not worth your little finger. They said goodbye. All the way back, Erin thought about Madeline's words. She came home, hugged the boys, and let the nanny go. Glenn was on duty today. Erin was already used to it, and usually fell asleep alone without problems. But today she hadn't slept a wink until almost morning. What if Glenn is also cheating on me? No, it cannot be. But Madeline was sure of it, and she is so pretty, she could be a model. And I am already a mature woman, a mother of 2 children. I certainly can't compete with 20-year-old nurses. Has my husband ever smelled of someone else's perfume? Come home with lipstick on his shirt? And the late-night phone calls and texts? Well, the last one certainly was. Being a doctor, Glenn was always on call, even during weekends and holidays, and Erin was used to it, and late-night calls did not raise her suspicions. Maybe I should talk to my husband about it. What will he tell me? Will he confess? I don't think so. And I will look stupid. He'll start to deny it. It'll only make me more suspicious. The next morning she opened her eyes with difficulty, and the first thing she saw was a huge bouquet of her favourite orchids. Happy anniversary, my love, Glenn said. This gesture reassured Erin that her husband was not cheating on her, and she dismissed her earlier suspicions as unfounded. Erin tried to forget her suspicions and Madeline's story. Besides, Madeline quit her job at the restaurant for a couple of months later because she had decided to move to another city after breaking up with her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the life went on, and soon Mrs. Sullivan announced her impending retirement. Yes, Erin, you will soon take over. I will bid adieu and travel to warmer lands to enjoy wine and charm the Spaniards. Erin responded with a laugh. I thought you preferred Italians. Mrs. Sullivan retorted, There's enough charm for everyone. I've done my share of work, that's enough. I bet you'll miss us, Erin sighed. Mrs. Sullivan shook her head. No, you're still young, full of energy, eager to command the kitchen. That's good. But I'm done. But if that's your decision, I won't object. I hope I'm ready. Of course you're ready, Mrs. Sullivan exclaimed. You've been ready for about 5 years. And so Erin became a chef. She now had full authority. She could experiment and change the whole menu. She began introducing her own dishes, which she had long wanted to try. She was thrilled when the guests enjoyed these new additions, and even more so when they ordered them again. However, with such responsibilities, she couldn't consider having a third child. Erin wanted a daughter, but both she and Glenn were working, and Erin put aside her dreams of a third child. On her husband's next birthday, Erin decided to surprise him. She discussed her plan with the boys, who supported her idea. Glenn was on duty the day before his birthday. Erin, Ron and Frank decided that when he came back from his shift and went to take a shower, they would quickly prepare their surprise. And now, after hearing that terrible conversation, Erin lay in bed, unable to rouse herself. Her husband would likely return from the shower soon. Although numerous improbable scenarios crossed her mind, Erin decided not to deceive herself. She chose to face the truth, irrespective of how dreadful it might be. She was strong and could endure. Why are you lying there, Mum? The younger son's voice, filled with childish excitement, broke her reverie. Brushing away her tears quickly, the woman lifted her head from the pillow and managed a smile. Ron and I are almost done, Frank reported. Resigned to reality, Erin got up. The sons had already brought balloons, hidden yesterday, inserted a candle into the cake, and held presents in their hands. This is yours, said the eldest, handing her a box. Erin smiled with effort and said, You guys are so good. Of course we are, Frank responded in a businesslike manner. The sound of the water stopped. All three of them stared at the bathroom door. When the birthday boy, wrapped in a terry robe, stepped out a minute later, they all started to sing Happy Birthday song in an unsteady chorus. Happy birthday, Daddy! The boys shouted in the end. Glenn smiled, glancing first at Ron, then Frank, and finally his wife. He then walked over and blew out the candle. The delighted boys clapped their hands and cheers before eagerly presenting their gifts. The father laughed, accepted the packages, and hugged his sons. Erin approached last. Happy birthday, she said, handing over her present. Thank you, Glenn replied. His sincere and honest smile made Erin's heart ache. That's why I never suspected anything all these years. He's been lying to me with the same expression. Of course I can't reveal my true feelings now, not with the boys expecting a party. Later I'll tell them everything. I'll have to, but now I'm not ready. So Erin pretended that everything was fine all day. Her sons seemed oblivious, but her husband occasionally gave her surprised glances, remaining silent. Only late at night, when the boys were already in bed, did he finally voice his worries. Erin, what's wrong? You seem strange today, he asked. The woman wrinkled her nose painfully. Well, you started it yourself. I know everything, she answered, calmly and coldly. Glenn laughed. A good attempt at a prank, but no, let's talk seriously. Erin sighed. I heard your phone conversation this morning. What did you hear? Her husband inquired. His voice had changed, becoming serious. You were talking to your mistress. She insisted you come right away, but you said you couldn't because of your wife. Yet you promised to meet her later. Glenn sighed and covered his face with his hands. Erin tried hard to hold back her tears. "So it's true," she exhaled. "I see." The husband removed his hands from his face, looking at his wife with a sense of helplessness. "I've been meaning to tell you. Let's go," he said. Erin was taken aback. "Where?" she asked. "To meet someone." Silence filled the car during the entire journey. Erin was probably still trying to process what was happening. He's taking me to meet his mistress. He even dared to admit he's been seeing her for a long time. Thinking like this, Erin felt a surge of tears and rage, but chose to remain silent. Finally, they stopped in front of a 5-story building. Her husband confidently got to the 3rd floor and rang the bell. Erin tensed, bracing herself for the encounter, but a small, grey-haired elderly woman opened the door. "Good evening," Glenn greeted her. "I hope we're not too late." The old woman glanced at Erin. "Not too late," she responded. "Jody hasn't gone to bed yet. Come in." Glenn nodded and resolutely walked into the apartment, with Erin trailing behind him. They made their way to the far room, where a girl of about 13 sat at a desk engrossed in a book. "Daddy!" she exclaimed upon seeing Glenn. Her excitement faded upon sighting Erin, and she even retreated a bit. Glenn turned to his wife and said, "Meet Jody, my daughter." This revelation left Erin so stunned that she barely remembered what happened next. She vaguely recalled sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea with an amiable elderly woman who seemed to be Jody's grandmother, while Jody was having a discussion with her father. After bidding farewell to the old woman and Jody, Erin and Glenn left for home. Once they were in the car, Glenn started to explain. "I should have told you about her a long time ago, but I was afraid." "Why?" Erin asked, noticing her voice was now strangely subdued and lifeless. Glenn replied, "There were several reasons. We had a perfect family, and suddenly there is a daughter. I wasn't sure how you or the kids would react. I thought it would be easier to leave things as they were." Erin nodded to indicate her understanding. "She's older than Ron, isn't she?" she finally asked, making up her mind. "Yes," her husband briefly replied. "We never discussed what kind of relationships we had before we met." "I didn't have much to tell." "Well, but I have. Just before we met, I was dating this girl named Dakota. She was just a few years older than me. It wasn't even dating, more like a no-strings-attached relationship. It lasted a few months until she got a job offer in another city and left." "Did you ever speak to her again?" Erin asked. "Never. Honestly, I forgot about her quickly because I met you soon." Glenn stopped the car and looked at his wife. "I've never cheated on you. I swear." "Continue." "I found out about Jody almost a year ago when Mrs. Malloy came to me. She's Jody's grandmother. She told me that when Dakota moved to another city, she realized she was pregnant, but decided to keep the baby and not tell me anything. I don't know why. Perhaps she didn't want to burden me, or was planning to marry someone else. Maybe she didn't want a man she didn't love to play an important role in her life." Erin started to piece things together. "So why did Jody's grandmother come to you? Did something happen to Dakota?" "She died of breast cancer. It was detected late and was a type that's difficult to treat. It's ironic since she was a doctor herself. Before her death, she told her mother everything. Mrs. Malloy initially wanted to raise her granddaughter herself, but then she decided that the girl would be better off with her father. She met me, and she said that she wouldn't insist on my care if I didn't want to." Erin smiled. "But you're not that kind of person. You wouldn't abandon your child." Glenn sighed. "Of course, I couldn't live peacefully knowing my daughter was growing up somewhere else. I met her. She was very emotional about her mother's death. I suggested that she and her grandmother move to our town. They've lived here ever since. I visit when I can and try to be involved in her life, helping her as much as I can." Glenn looked at his wife with growing concern. "Say something. If you want a divorce, I'll understand." Erin laughed. "A divorce? Because my husband is the most decent man in the world? Glenn, I love you even more." Erin squinted her eyes and re-examined the plot. "There's a lot of work to be done. At least half of the trees need to be cut down and replaced. The beds are ruined too. It will be easier to start from scratch. But it's not a problem. With such a team, we'll have everything back in order in no time." She was also fond of the house. It was large, just as she had dreamed. There was enough rooms for everyone. A spacious room for her and Glenn, and at the end of the corridor, rooms for Ron and Frank. On the other side of the corridor were bedrooms for Mrs. Malloy and Jody. Erin smiled, remembering her husband's concerns about whether she would get along with the girl. Erin, on the other hand, was thrilled to have the daughter finally she had long dreamed of. Jody was a sweet, well-behaved girl. Initially, she was wary of Erin, but they were growing closer every day. Mrs. Malloy was also a nice woman, and it was unquestionable that she wouldn't be separated from her only granddaughter. Then Erin suggested to her husband that they should buy a house. They had been contemplating the idea for a while, but never seemed to find the time. But now, with the arrival of Jody and her grandmother in their family, they had to speed up their decision. An ideal house appeared on the classified site, as if by magic. It was spacious and priced within their budget. "Erin, are you coming?" Jody's timid voice echoed from behind. "Grandma's already set the table." Turning around, Erin asked, "Of course, sweetheart. By the way, how do you like it here?" Jody shrugged. "There's lots of room and it's quiet. I love that." "Me too." Erin noticed that Jody seemed to want to ask something. "What is it, Jody?" Jody sighed. "Erin, don't you regret it?" Erin raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Regret what? That we moved here from the apartment?" "No, not that." "That you learned about me? If Dad hadn't told you, none of this would have happened." Erin smiled and hugged Jody. "Believe me, Jody, you are a gift of fate for me. I'm so glad you came into my life." She felt Jody's quiet sobs as she held her close and smiled, feeling warm, salty tears on her own cheek.
"So, Doug, should I expect you tomorrow, or are you only coming around next week?"
The head of the loaders brigade handed a few notes to a tall, wiry boy with light blonde, slightly curly hair. Doug Williams gratefully accepted the money from the foreman for his shift at unloading. "We'll see," Doug replied with a smile. "If I don't manage my other part-time job by evening, then don't wait." The foreman nodded in understanding.
"Always trying to make ends meet, huh? I respect that, Doug. You're a hard worker. I haven't met anyone like you in a long time. People usually come to us out of great need or to earn money for booze."
Doug took a deep breath and answered,
"You might say I'm here out of great need, because drinking never interested me."
The men shook hands and parted. Doug was thankful to the man for always being ready to take him on shift. There was always a need for workers to load and unload goods at the station dock, so Doug had a steady part-time job. Doug turned 25 last month. He celebrated modestly, buying a large bag of his favourite sugar biscuits from a cheap supermarket and sharing them with his neighbours at the abandoned house where he had lived for the past 2 years. Doug had spent most of his life on the streets, wandering the region or settling temporarily in quiet towns where people were more tolerant of vagrants than in the bustling metropolis. The young man was fortunate this time. He quickly befriended a group of homeless individuals who, like him, were highly intelligent and kind-hearted, but had unfortunately fallen on hard times. Together they settled in the spacious abandoned house, where they managed to create a decent living space. Doug was not a typical homeless person who drowned his despair in alcohol or resorted to theft. He earned a modest but honest living through legal means. He worked in processing at a recycling plant or served as a labourer at the railway station. This was his standard survival strategy, which helped him to avoid any criminal activities. Doug preferred not to dwell on his childhood. His experience in the orphanage was harsh. The caregivers often mistreated him and the other children because they seemed to dislike children in general. They justified their harsh methods as realistic education. However, Doug suspected these caregivers were people who took pleasure in tormenting those weaker than themselves. Young Doug often ran away from the orphanage to escape the constant beatings and reproaches. Then he would just hang around the streets, imagining what his life could have been like if he had been lucky enough to be born into a normal, loving family. The final straw that prompted him to permanently leave the orphanage was an incident that occurred during his teenage years. During one of his unauthorized absences, Doug rescued a small, affectionate puppy from a cruel man. The man had stopped on a bridge, intending to throw the puppy, confined in a packed cardboard box, into the river. Doug happened to be passing by and heard the puppy whimpering. He quickly realized there was a living creature inside the box. "Hey man, what are you doing?" Doug asked the burly man, who was about to hurl the box into the water.
"None of your business. Get out of here, kid, while your arms and legs are still intact,"
said the man rudely, and turned around to look at Doug. But as soon as he did so, Doug's insides clenched in pain and anger. Standing before him was not just any man, but Richard Watson, the headmaster of their orphanage. Doug had suspected for some time that their director had a mental abnormality, but such cruelty towards a puppy in broad daylight was beyond comprehension. Doug couldn't stand by and let this happen. "Mr. Watson, please put the box down," Doug requested as calmly as he could. "Don't harm the puppy."
"What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at roll call?"
the headmaster replied with a malicious grin, and then threatened the orphanage pupil.
"I'll report this to Mr. Roth. He'll deal with you in his own way. Maybe then you'll understand that running away from the orphanage isn't the best idea."
At these words, Doug literally felt a pain from the bruises, still healing from the last educational conversation with the physical education teacher, Mr. Roth. He was known for using various objects when reprimanding his students. That time, Doug had been beaten with the janitor's shovel. Doug's body was covered with abrasions and bruises, rendering him bedridden for a week. Despite this, the headmaster and the teaching staff of the orphanage believed such disciplinary actions significantly improved discipline and calmness within the institution. Many children, especially the newcomers or older ones, attempted to report the teachers to the police. Sadly, their pleas fell on deaf ears. Doug suspected the local police officer was the headmaster's friend. That's why he deliberately ignored the ongoing violence and brutality. Doug chose not to contemplate the fate of those boys who sought help from other adults. He only knew such attempts were severely punished at the orphanage. "Put the box on the floor, please," the teenager asked again, more insistently this time.
"Or what?"
Mr. Watson retorted, a grin of insolence on his face. He dangled the box over the silvery surface of the river, holding it so that it practically hung from his fingers.
"You fool, Doug. No matter how many times I beat you, you never learn. Pity and feelings are our greatest weaknesses and enemies in life. Oh, you took pity on a street dog? Have you ever considered what will happen when it grows up? It'll be just like you, wandering the streets. At best, it'll starve to death under some fence. At worst, they'll catch her and do unimaginable things to her. Things you wouldn't dream of in your worst nightmares."
Saying this, the headmaster studied the box with the puppy for a while, and then added in a muted tone,
"In a way, I'm doing this dog a favour, showing her mercy. Better to end its suffering now than to let them magnify 100-fold later."
"Who are you to determine who gets to live and who doesn't?" Doug retorted defiantly, his voice echoing with a steely resolve.
You don't have the authority to inflict harm on the children in the orphanage either, so you'd better give me the puppy if you don't want to make things worse for you."
"Are you threatening to make my life difficult?"
Mr. Watson responded, a sudden burst of laughter escaping him.
"Oh, that's funny. Listen here, Williams. Remember this. I won't hesitate to grind you to dust with my own bare hands, if it comes to that. Your existence will remain unknown. The world doesn't have a place for people like you. One less vagrant on the streets means one less mouth to feed. Your absence won't cause anyone to shed a tear."
Deciding that it was the opportune moment to act, Doug lunged at the headmaster. With a quick, well-aimed move, he aimed a kick at the man's shin. Caught off guard, the headmaster let out a howl of pain and involuntarily let the box out of his hands.
"Williams,"
the furious headmaster bellowed,
"once you're back at the orphanage, I'll make sure you feel the wrath of my hands. You'll end up in the infirmary for a month, licking your injuries. You ungrateful little brat."
Doug, however, did not wait around to hear more. Without a moment's hesitation, he scooped up the box and ran. He ran down the street as fast as his legs would carry him. Returning to the orphanage was now out of the question for Doug. He was painfully aware that if he did, he would be subjected to a severe punishment. The headmaster was right. Nobody would be aware of his plight, and he would not be missed. Having reached a seemingly safe place, a distant street in a residential area of the city, Doug finally allowed himself to stop. He sat down on an old bench, carefully placing the box beside him. With trembling fingers, Doug cautiously opened the box to discover a pair of terrified black eyes and a sharp fox-like face staring back at him. The puppy was a thin, underfed crossbreed of a dachshund and a breed similar to a corgi. Upon seeing Doug, the puppy whimpered again and attempted to stick her head out. "Come here, little one," Doug coaxed, gently lifting the dog out of the box. He held it close to his chest and started stroking her softly, while the puppy continued whimpering. "Don't cry. Everything will surely turn out all right from this point forward," Doug, in his soothing voice, reassured the trembling creature. The little puppy, with its pitiful eyes, looked up at the young boy and then, in a gesture of trust, nestled itself against him, seeking comfort and warmth. "I've decided that I'll call you Lucky. Does that sound all right to you?" Doug asked the dog. Upon hearing the sound of his new name, the puppy began to wag her tail with such enthusiasm. It was as if she was expressing his approval of the name chosen. "That's wonderful, Lucky. We're about to embark on an entirely new chapter of our lives now, and no one will dare to infringe upon our happiness, especially not those miscreants from the orphanage." Lucky seemed to comprehend Doug's tone, and in response let out a soft, yet assertive growl. "Yes, my dear companion, I'm overjoyed that you're with me," the boy responded softly, and gently cradling the puppy in his arms, started to amble down the quiet street. From that moment onward, Doug and Lucky were an inseparable duo. A couple of years later, Lucky grew into a beautiful, stout, chocolate-coloured dog that bore striking similarities to a corgi. Doug would always bring her along on his small wandering around the town and its outskirts. Unfortunately, a year ago, Lucky passed away. Doug buried her in a forest belt outside the city and took a long time to recover from this profound loss. After finishing his shift at the rail station, the young man returned to his dwelling. His fellow tenants were waiting for him, having decided to make fish soup in a small cast-iron cauldron that evening. The unbearable aroma of tinned fish soup, which most likely was long overdue, made Doug involuntarily wrinkle his nose at the foul smell, but he managed to maintain a friendly smile on his face as he waved at the other homeless people. "Oh, Doug's back!" exclaimed Carlos, a former stock market speculator who gambled so much that he lost not only his savings but also his house. "We're cooking fish soup here. It's almost ready. Come, join us," his neighbour invited him. "Thank you, Carlos," Doug responded, nodding respectfully towards the chowder. I'm sure this soup will be delicious, but I've already eaten today. Maybe next time." "I see. You don't want to overeat at night." Carlos playfully winked at him. "All you young folks are watching your figure, even when you're at the bottom of the life. For me, if there's an opportunity to eat, take it." Carlos kept muttering something good-natured under his nose, while Doug managed to slip into his room. There, he carefully transferred the day's earnings from unloading to a special tin box. The next day, he planned to visit the local shopping centre to buy new trainers. His current pair, worn for the last few years, were falling apart. He had been diligently saving from each paycheck for a new pair he had already eyed in the sale section of the store. After a strenuous day, Doug settled comfortably into his makeshift bed and instantly fell asleep. Having worked a shift at the station, he always managed to fall asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. The next day, Doug enjoyed bright, colourful window shopping at the shopping centre. Finally deciding to shop for shoes, Doug traversed the long archway leading to another section of the mall. En route, he passed a bustling children's playground. The sight of children laughing and playing with an oversized inflatable ball brought a smile to his face. He found himself yearning for a similar childhood, one without fear, waiting for loving parents who would treat him to delicious ice cream. A sudden rush of tears blurred his vision, which he quickly wiped away. And then he noticed something unusual. In the back of the bustling playground, there stood an impressively tall, square-shaped stage with a ramp. It was engulfed in a multitude of bright lights that painted the area with a festive and joyful mood. This stage, as Doug knew, was a place for animators who performed lively shows to delight and entertain the children, while their parents were off busying themselves with shopping. However, at this moment, there were no adults within sight. This was an anomaly, especially considering the safety rules that stipulated there should always be someone present to keep an eye on the working electrical device. Doug, heeding an inner instinct, approached the stage. Suddenly he noticed a worrying sight. The base of the stage was beginning to emit a trail of smoke. Adjacent to the stage, a young girl of about 6 or 7 years old was engrossed in her own world, playing with an oversized teddy bear. She was blissfully unaware of the potential danger brewing behind her. The smoke from beneath the stage grew denser, and the acrid smell of burning wires filled Doug's nostrils. "Hey, girl!" shouted Doug, trying to alert the little girl. "You need to move away from here, it's not safe." The young girl looked at him with a puzzled expression, shrugged her shoulders and then turned back to her teddy bear, seemingly unperturbed by his warning. Doug looked around nervously, trying to find the person on duty. However, there was still no one on the spot. "Hey!" Doug called out again, this time with a sense of urgency. "I'm not joking. It's really dangerous. Can't you see the smoke?" Just as he finished his sentence, the stage hissed violently, like an enraged serpent. The multitude of light bulbs embedded in it began to burst, one after another, creating a cacophony of loud pops and crackles. A hot wave of sparks and flames immediately engulfed the surrounding space. Recognizing the imminent danger, Doug did not hesitate. Grabbing the little girl, Doug only had time to dig her with his body as the whole burning structure collapsed on him with a rumble. The girl in his arms cried loudly, but the young man only pressed her harder against him. Doug felt no pain. His senses were numbed, creating an illusionary vacuum around him, punctuated only by distant, muffled screams and a woman's frantic shriek that cut through the air. The realization that his back was searing with pain jolted him back to reality. With adrenaline fueling his every move, Doug urgently freed himself from the wreckage, all the while clutching a little girl close to his chest. "Give her to me!" A shrill female voice pierced the cacophony of sounds around him. Without a second thought, Doug handed the girl over to the woman, gasping for breath. "Don't move. I've already alerted the fire department and the ambulance," the woman ordered, and then proceeded to douse Doug's smouldering back with a hand-held fire extinguisher. The sudden, shocking contrast in temperature
sent chills down his spine, and, overwhelmed, Doug sank into unconsciousness. His final conscious memory was the distraught face of a young girl. She wore a large rainbow-coloured bow in her hair, her mascara running down her cheeks in black rivulets due to her incessant tears. "God, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice shaky and laced with guilt. These words echoed in Doug's mind as his world was engulfed by darkness. When Doug awoke, he found himself in the sterile environment of a hospital's intensive care unit, lying on his stomach. The doctor explained to him that he had undergone major surgery due to the extensive and severe burns on his back. "You'll need ample time for recovery," the doctor warned. "You're fortunate that your nerve endings were not damaged. It could have been much worse. That girl at the shopping centre did the right thing by extinguishing the fire on your back promptly." "The girl," Doug murmured weakly. "There was a little girl. Is she unharmed?" "The little girl is fine, don't worry," the doctor reassured him. "You've acted like a true hero. Now your job is to rest and recover. The little girl has been safely returned to her father. The shopping centre management and their electricians will be held accountable. It appears they overlooked a fault which resulted in a loose contact and subsequently a short circuit." Barely able to process the information, Doug managed to ask, "How did you know all this?" "I have a friend who is the chief of the fire brigade that responded to the incident," the doctor replied with a sad smile. "I'm telling you all this so you can rest easy." "What about the young woman on duty? She left the playground and children unattended," Doug inquired, his voice barely audible. The doctor shrugged. "I don't have information about her, but she won't be let off easily." He then stood up to leave, adding, "I'll have the nurse administer another dose of anesthesia. Rest, and we'll change your dressing later." Left alone, Doug began to process the events. He felt relief knowing the little girl was safe. He also felt a tinge of sympathy for the woman on duty, despite her negligence. Of course, she didn't want this to happen. A lengthy and challenging journey of recovery began for Doug. His days in the hospital were filled with the monotony of endless bandage changes, the incessant itching that came from healing skin, and the haunting nightmares in which he relived the horrifying scene of the burning mall. But after a month of treatment, his attending physician finally said, "Well, you'll be staying with us for a couple more weeks, and then you'll be done," the doctor said with a comforting smile on his face. "You'll be as good as new, except for a few scars on your back." "It's nothing," Doug shrugged it off. "Doctor, you have no idea how much I'm yearning to leave this place. Don't get me wrong, I'm tremendously grateful to you for everything you've done for me, but—" "Say no more," the doctor responded calmly. "Do you think I don't understand? A hospital is a hospital. The important thing is to keep your visits here as infrequent as possible. Please excuse speaking about that, but I see that life hasn't been exactly kind to you. Where will you go when you're discharged?" Doug looked at the compassionate doctor with a warm smile. He appreciated the man's genuine care and understanding, and was touched by his sincere concern for his well-being. "I have a place," Doug replied. "If my acquaintances haven't given it away, I'll return there. If it's already occupied, well, I'll find another place to spend the night." The doctor shook his head in disappointment. "It's not right that a kind-hearted young man like you will sleep on the streets. Here." He reached into the pocket of his medical coat and pulled out a business card. "Try this if things get too rough. It's the new charity centre that opened just 2 months ago. They provide assistance to the homeless, including meals, a place to sleep and wash, if space is available. They can also help with employment opportunities. They sometimes have job openings from social services that they collaborate with, and from small private firms looking for handymen. Please take it, it might be helpful." Doug gratefully accepted the business card and shook the doctor's outstretched hand. 2 weeks after his discharge, Doug returned to his makeshift home in the abandoned house. Much to his relief,
not much had changed during his absence. His old vagabond acquaintances still lived there, and they had taken care of his belongings. "Doug, we thought we had lost you for good. Where have you been all this time?" asked Carlos. "I had an accident." Doug shared his story, detailing everything that had occurred. At the end of his storytelling, he added, "I sincerely appreciate you keeping my place and not discarding any of my belongings." "What are you talking, Doug? How could we?" exclaimed Carlos, hugging him. "You're like family to us. We thought something happened to you, but you don't carry a phone, so we didn't know where to look." "Yes, it's a problem, I agree," Doug said apologetically. "Don't worry, Carlos. I promise I'll solve this issue when I get the chance. We really need to stay in contact." Carlos nodded in agreement. Afterward, they went to drink tea, which their third acquaintance, Scott, had already brewed. This silent, homeless man only voiced his opinion on special occasions. Nobody knew much about him, other than his love for fishing and a rumoured past in the police force. The latter was always discussed in whispers and taken as more of a rumour. "Hello, Doug," Scott greeted him discreetly. "Glad you're okay." Doug nodded back at him and settled onto the old straw mattress, and right away a dull pain shot through his back. He gritted his teeth, trying not to show his discomfort to the others. Despite his efforts, his suddenly pale face gave him away. "Doug, are you ill?" Carlos asked excitedly, promptly bringing a mug of tea to his lips. "Drink this, dear. It should make you feel better." Doug thanked his neighbour and sipped the hot drink. To his surprise, it was excellent black tea, with raspberry leaves floating in it. "I've been drying leaves since last summer," Scott answered his unasked question. "Regardless of what others say, I believe nature is better than any chemistry for healing." "You're right," Doug responded. "The hospital warned me that my back would ache until the skin fully healed. I didn't expect it to be this bad." The young man sighed heavily and hung his head. He had hoped the healing process was complete and would no longer need the painkillers that left him dizzy. However, it wasn't that simple. "I think I'll go lie down if you don't mind," Doug said, standing up. The men nodded as Doug slowly returned to his place. After swallowing 2 pills of the medicine with a gulp of water, he collapsed onto the hard mattress. That night he couldn't sleep properly. Shadows danced in the darkness, and cold sweat drenched his forehead and neck. After tossing and turning for several hours, Doug gave up trying to sleep. Instead, he carefully sat up in bed and pulled out the business card the doctor had given him. "I'll go there tomorrow," Doug decided. "Maybe they can help me." The next morning, Doug visited the charity centre first thing. He hoped to find a job and perhaps get a free lunch in the canteen. A polite woman greeted him at the entrance, and after understanding his purpose, guided him to the employment office. Unfortunately, luck was not on Doug's side at this point. All the available vacancies were filled. A social worker advised him to return in early September. Doug sighed but nodded in understanding and thanked the worker for her time. He then made his way to the large dining room on the first floor. Upon entering, he was greeted by the wonderful aroma of freshly cooked chicken chowder and the scent of vegetable stew. He joined the queue of 20 other hungry homeless people who had arrived at the centre that morning, patiently awaiting his turn with his tray and cutlery. Finally reaching the serving window, 2 volunteers, a young man and a woman, were serving food that day. The man was busy serving soup to another person, so Doug had to speak to the woman, whose long wavy curls were hidden under a grey cap. "Hello, can I have a portion of soup? It smells so good in here," Doug said. "Sure," she replied, smiling as she ladled a large portion of hot golden broth onto his plate. "Grab a second portion as well. The cook made a lot today, guessing that there would be a lot of people coming in." As the woman handed him his plate, their eyes met, and all of a sudden she turned as pale as the first snow, nearly dropping the ladle from her trembling fingers. Doug stared at her, unable to believe his eyes. "You?" was all Doug could utter. "Oh!" she shrieked, hastily placing the plate on Doug's tray, nearly spilling its contents. I'm sorry.
She quickly turned to her partner, her voice trembling. "Ben, can you cover me for a minute? I don't feel well." She took off her apron and slipped out from behind the counter, ignoring the unhappy murmurs from the other diners. "Wait, you misunderstood me," Doug shouted after her. She either didn't hear him or chose to ignore him, continuing to move between the glass food display cases until she disappeared into the kitchen. "Man, don't hold up the queue," a gruff voice called from behind Doug. Doug apologized, left the canteen and rushed after the serving girl. She was the same girl who had abandoned the children on that fateful day at the shopping centre. Doug immediately recognized her large grey eyes, which were makeup-free today. He could see the genuine guilt and fear in those eyes. Around the charity centre building, Doug spotted her again sitting on a bench near the back entrance, crying bitterly. "What's wrong?" Doug asked. "Are you so upset with me? I didn't mean to frighten you, I'm sorry." The distressed girl slowly took her palm away from her weeping and tear-stained face and looked at Doug with unbearable bitterness. "God, I feel so guilty. Please, forgive me if you can. I just thought you wanted revenge on me personally." "Why?" Doug asked with a slight smile. "You've suffered so much because of me," the girl sobbed. I thought you'd be crippled. I tried to visit you at the hospital, but the doctor wouldn't let me in. Only family members were allowed." "Wait, you came to the hospital to see me?" Doug was taken aback, never expecting this young woman, barely 20, would care about his condition after what happened at the mall. "Don't think I haven't been punished," she tried to explain. "I was fired that same day, wasn't paid for my shift, and was even fined heavily. They blamed me for the stage catching fire. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just went to wash my hands. I was painting with the kids and needed to clean off the paint. I was only gone for 5 minutes. Who knew it would turn out so badly?" She lowered her head into her hands, sobbing. "Please understand me. I don't have any more money to help you," she said through her tears. "I still owe money to this mall from my salary." Doug felt deeply sorry for this unfortunate girl, who seemed to be as much a victim as he was. Sitting next to her on the bench, Doug reached out his hand. "My name is Doug. What's yours?" The girl slowly looked up at him, then cautiously shook his hand. "I'm Mary." "Nice to meet you," Doug responded, smiling. "Mary, please don't worry so much. I'm not angry with you over the fire. Thankfully, we were able to save that little girl, and none of the other children were hurt." "Really?" Mary asked, hope shining in her reddened eyes. "You mean you don't want to demand huge compensation from me, or curse me to my 7th knee?" Doug laughed softly and shook his head. "No, that was definitely not in my plans. I was angry with you at first, thinking you had abandoned the children, but now I see you're being honest. It was just an unfortunate coincidence." Mary gave him a weak smile through her tears. "Thank you for believing me. It's just a shame the shopping centre and playground management don't see it that way. To some extent they're right. I shouldn't have left the playground, but the stage had been malfunctioning for a while, and when it couldn't handle another power surge, the blame fell on the most vulnerable employee. That's me." She gave a sad grin and wiped her face with her uniform sleeve. "Do you volunteer here every day?" Doug asked. "No, only twice a week," Mary answered. "Now I sell tickets at the cinema, and I come here because I like helping people, that's all." She shrugged bashfully. At that moment, Doug realised he wanted to see Mary again. "So, now that we've cleared that up, would you mind if I visit during your shifts?" Doug asked hopefully. Mary studied him before nodding. "And not just here. Come to the North Wind tomorrow night. It's the cinema where I work. They just got a new action film. I'll let you in, and you can watch it in peace." Doug was ecstatic. The chance to see Mary again and to visit a cinema, which he hadn't done since he was 10, delighted him, and he thanked her profusely. "Oh, please," Mary responded, laughing at his gratitude. "I'm just glad I could do something for you." Doug looked at her solemnly. "You know, I just realised something." "What's that?" Mary asked, intrigued. "If you hadn't put out the fire from me, then, in the shopping centre, I wouldn't be sitting here now." Mary's cheeks turned bright red, and she quickly lowered her glowing grey eyes. "I have to go, Doug. I need to finish my shift." With that, Mary hopped off the bench and ran back into the charity centre, leaving Doug alone with his thoughts and the budding feelings of first love. Another month passed. Doug continued his life as usual, but now Mary, whom he began dating, became a part of it. It was important to him that Mary saw his vagrancy not as a negative aspect, but just another part of him. The girl did not care that Doug lived in the old abandoned house. Instead, she felt genuine sympathy and tenderness for him. They didn't voice it, but both understood that their feelings for each other were real. Mary knew that Doug needed to get his life first, so she refrained from declaring her love. Coming from a modest background herself, she did her best to afford the rent for her room in a small hostel. In short, the relationship between Doug and Mary developed in its own way, and between them reigned idyll and mutual understanding. Doug found it odd that Mary didn't like talking about her parents. He had openly told her about his upbringing in an orphanage and his escape from its dreadful conditions. Mary expressed sincere affection for Doug, yet only revealed that her parents never understood her. That's why she chose to live independently and move from the village to the city. Doug empathized, acknowledging the generational gap could often cause misunderstandings. However, he expressed hope that Mary might eventually reconcile with her family. "To be honest, I don't really believe in it," Mary told him. "My dad is such a stern and overbearing man that he will never forgive me for living here. He's very conservative and hates the thought of living any other way than what he dictates." Doug hugged Mary tightly and promised her, "You'll see, Mary, everything will be fine with you, for sure. I'm ready to move mountains for you. I've been promised a job at your volunteer centre in the autumn. I hope it will help me improve my social standing." "I believe you, Doug," Mary said quietly, burying her nose in his jacket. "I believe in you, and will support you in everything, I promise." One day, while Doug was unloading goods at the railway station, Scott unexpectedly approached him. Doug was surprised because the usually silent homeless man had never shown interest in his work, especially not in broad daylight. "Hello, Scott," Doug greeted him. "Everything all right? Nothing happened at home?" "No," Scott shook his head. "Well, I didn't come empty-handed. Here, take this." With these words, he pulled a small folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Doug. "What's this?" Doug asked in surprise. "And you unfold it there, and you'll find out what's in it," said Scott a little grumpily. "I don't make a habit of reading other people's letters." Doug looked at the man in puzzlement, but unfolded the note. It contained only a few sentences. "Dear Mr. Williams, I suggest you visit the Blue Tower Business Centre to receive a legitimate reward for saving my daughter. I know this seems like a rather belated offer, but I was on a long business trip abroad. I hope you won't refuse to meet me. Anthony Greenspan, CEO of White Sales." "Where did you get this note? Who gave it to you?" Doug asked Scott. But the man simply shook his head. "I don't know who wrote it. A man in black approached me on the street. He handed me this note and told me the sooner the better. He also gave me 200s for quick delivery." Scott smiled slyly and pointed to the note in Doug's hands. "Serious people must be interested in you, if they're sending messengers. If I were you, I'd go there today to see what they have to offer." Doug just shrugged his shoulders. He understood the note was from the businessman whose daughter he had saved from a fire at the playground some time ago, but he didn't expect any reward, because that's what any decent person would do. Despite everything, a strange feeling told him it was worth going to the business centre. a premonition Doug had started to trust. After wrapping up his work, he made his way to the Blue Tower. This enormous business high-rise was situated in the city's most prestigious district, filled with luxury stores and business-clad pedestrians. For a moment, Doug felt like he had stepped into an entirely different world. His modest residence was on the city's outskirts, and he rarely ventured into the city centre. He preferred to stay out of sight of the police and not cross paths with the wealthy. Aware of his position in the city social system, he tried not to cause any trouble for himself or others. Nonetheless, deep down, Doug yearned for a taste of the lifestyle of these well-dressed individuals, dining in upscale restaurants and driving fancy cars. "Good afternoon," he greeted the receptionist upon entering the business centre. "I'm here to see Mr. Greenspan. I have an appointment." The receptionist, a girl with neatly straightened hair and a ballerina-like figure, examined Doug sceptically from head to toe. Then her thin eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Your surname, please?" she requested in a neutral tone, preparing to check her work tablet. "Doug Williams," Doug responded, thinking he would be thrown out of there any moment. However, a minute later, the woman politely smiled at him. "Mr. Greenspan is expecting you. Please proceed to the 24th floor, where someone will meet you and escort you to the correct office." Doug briefly thanked the secretary and cautiously entered the dazzlingly sparkling, completely transparent glass elevator. Upon arriving upstairs, he was greeted by Mr. Greenspan's personal guard, who escorted him to the businessman's office. As he approached the door, Doug felt an unusual excitement, as if his entire life relied on this meeting with the renowned businessman. "Calm down," Doug mentally instructed himself. "Why are you nervous, Doug? You were assured that the girl is fine." Doug entered the spacious, lavishly furnished office and stood silently in the centre. Directly in front of him, with his back to Doug, stood Mr. Greenspan, one of the region's most influential businessmen. The tall, athletic man, appearing around 50, held a small cup of black coffee in his hands and patiently waited for his unusual guest. "I'm glad you came to see me today, Doug," the businessman said, turning around. "I've long wanted to meet the man who saved my daughter's life." Upon seeing Doug, Mr. Greenspan's hands trembled, almost spilling coffee on his suit. His complexion paled, resembling a sheet of office paper, and he clutched the back of his leather chair for support. "Are you feeling ill?" a puzzled Doug asked. "Should I call an ambulance?" "My pills are in the cupboard on the top shelf. Please fetch them." Without a word, Doug retrieved the medication and delivered it with a glass of water. The businessman swallowed the pills and unexpectedly seized Doug's right hand, focusing on a small, round mole under his thumb. "Should I call an ambulance after all?" Doug asked, concern tinging his voice. "You don't appear to be well." Mr. Greenspan raised his pale face to him and quietly commanded, "Please sit down. We need to have a serious discussion." From Mr. Greenspan's stern tone, Doug anticipated an intense conversation. As he carefully settled into the chair opposite, Mr. Greenspan rose, closed the office door, and locked it from the inside. "Tell me about yourself," the businessman began. "Who are you? Where did you grow up? Who are your parents?" "But why are you interested in that?" Doug asked, reasonably curious. In response, Mr. Greenspan merely raised his eyebrows suggestively. "You see, I need to understand a certain matter, and I can't do so without the full context of some events. So, begin." The man patted Doug encouragingly on the shoulder, then reclined in his chair, folded his hands and prepared to listen attentively. With a sigh, Doug proceeded to recount his life story, his time in the orphanage, his friend Lucky, and his current residence in an abandoned house with other homeless people. Upon finishing his tale, Doug deeply regretted his decision to come here. It was evident that something was off with this businessman.
After listening to Doug's story, an astonished Mr. Greenspan whispered, "Truly, your ways are mysterious, Lord." Then Mr. Greenspan slowly turned his right palm towards Doug. To Doug's surprise, under the thumb of the businessman's right hand was a mole identical to his own. "Wow, what a coincidence," Doug muttered, gazing at the mole. He was utterly perplexed by what this eccentric rich man could possibly want from him. "No, son, it's not a coincidence at all." Mr. Greenspan shook his head. "I'm going to show you something now. Just promise me that you won't try to run away or do anything out of the ordinary. All right?" Doug felt uneasy. He had no idea what Mr. Greenspan was planning, but he knew he couldn't just run away. "All right," Doug nodded. Mr. Greenspan gave him a slightly confused look and opened his laptop, saying, "I decided to digitalize the family photo archive a while ago, so it must be here somewhere. Wait a minute." He nervously searched his computer, then exclaimed loudly, "Yes, here they are. Take a look, Doug." Mr. Greenspan turned the laptop screen towards the young man. Doug, looking at several photos displayed, was struck with amazement. His own reflection stared back at him from old colour photos taken in the 80s and early 90s. A young man, looking strikingly similar to Doug, smiled pleasantly at the camera. The only differences were his clothes and a slightly different hairstyle, distinguishing him from Doug. "Who is it?" Doug stuttered. "Why does he look so much like me?" Mr. Greenspan merely smiled indulgently. "It's me, Doug, in person. Doesn't he look like me?" The man pointed his hand questioningly at himself, offering Doug a visual comparison. Only then did Doug notice the striking similarity between the businessman and the young man in the photo. They had the same slightly curly hair, the same light green eyes, and they also mirrored Doug's appearance. "How is that possible?" Doug asked Mr. Greenspan with a hoarse voice. The businessman sighed heavily, his smile instantly fading. "You see, many years ago, when I was just starting my business, I learned how ruthless business partners can be, especially if you refuse to give them half your business and capital." "You mean," Doug interrupted, "someone betrayed you?" "My best friend," Mr. Greenspan nodded, "and also my partner, my right-hand man." The man leaned back heavily in his chair, lost in his memories. "Alejandro had been with me for as long as I can remember. We attended school and college together. Later we started a business together. He was my assistant, an excellent negotiator, but it seemed like he was always hiding something from me." Mr. Greenspan began, taking a deep breath before sorrowfully concluding, "It's a pity I understood it too late. When he came with his guys and said ultimately that I should give him my half of the business, I was stunned. I lost my voice, unable to comprehend that my best friend could steal from me. But Alejandro wasn't joking." As Mr. Greenspan shared his story, his hands slowly clenched into fists, reflecting the pain and despair of a past he couldn't change. "He took me to the forest and beat me so severely that I mentally bid farewell to my wife and son. I survived miraculously. A hunter accidentally found me the next morning and, frightened, called an ambulance." Doug listened to the man's story in amazement. However, one question tormented Doug. How does he fit into Mr. Greenspan's story? Soon Doug would find his answer. As it turned out, Alejandro wasn't satisfied with just destroying me. He wanted to take away my most precious possession, something I wouldn't hesitate to give my life for, Mr. Greenspan said, looking at Doug. "He succeeded, Doug. He kidnapped my only son, demanding a huge ransom and all my shares." Doug exhaled loudly, anticipating the tragic conclusion of the story. "What did you do?" he asked cautiously. I did what any desperate man would do. I trusted the police. What a fatal mistake," Mr. Greenspan exclaimed, thumping his fist on the table and causing the papers on it to jump. "I told him I had the ransom and was ready to hand over it, but when we got to the location, nobody was there. Alejandro called me and said I would never see my son again. He didn't specify what he did, but made it clear that I shouldn't hope for anything more." Mr. Greenspan wiped his face with a handkerchief, removing the sweat that had formed, and ended his story. "I managed to keep the business, but I lost you forever, son," he said, addressing Doug. "I searched for you everywhere, both in the country and abroad, but found nothing. It was as if someone had intentionally erased all traces leading to you." Only then did it dawn on Doug that Mr. Greenspan had mistaken him for his long-lost son, who had disappeared more than 20 years ago. "No, I'm sorry, but that can't be," he muttered uncertainly. "If we were relatives, surely someone at the orphanage would have told me about this." "How?" the businessman asked, skepticism in his eyes. "The aim of those people was to hide you as far away as possible, preferably so you could never even suspect that you could be a wealthy man's son. Maybe that's why they put you in such a terrible place, hoping you wouldn't endure the horrific conditions there." Mr. Greenspan sadly shook his head. "It's a pity your mum didn't live to see this moment, Doug. She died shortly after learning you would never return home. The pain was too much for her heart. Ellie, my daughter, the girl you saved, she's the child of my second wife, Helen. Ellie is a wonderful girl. I'll be eternally grateful to you for saving your half-sister." "What?" Doug couldn't believe his ears. "Are you telling me that Ellie and I we're related?" Anthony Greenspan nodded in reply and showed Doug his birthmark again. "You see, this birthmark is passed from father to son in our family. My grandfather had it, I have it too, and it's also on you. There's no doubt about it, but if you allow me, I would like to do a DNA test to finally dispel your doubts." Doug sat across from the businessman, utterly bewildered. He exclaimed, "What a twist! I came seeking help and ended up finding my own father. Is this real, or am I dreaming?" Doug had always dreamed of escaping the streets, but he lacked knowledge, education, and simple human connections. He couldn't believe his sudden stroke of luck. "So," he concluded hesitantly, "there's a chance you're my father?" "I'm more than sure. I'm 100% sure," replied Mr. Greenspan with a smile. "If you'd like, we can go to the lab today for confirmation. Doug, I'm serious. I've been searching for you for years. You're my direct heir. I need to teach you everything I know so you can take over the company. And don't worry, you'll get a proper education too. You can attend any university in the country. But please don't leave now," he pleaded, his gaze filled with longing. Overwhelmed, Doug rose from his seat and embraced Anthony Greenspan tightly. Through his tears, he whispered, "I'm so glad you've found me at last." Anthony Greenspan hugged him back just as tightly and said, "Doug, my son, I thank God for giving me the chance to find you again." Their embrace was tight, as though they were trying to make up for the lost years in a single hug. The DNA test confirmed the blood relationship between Doug and Anthony Greenspan. The father planned to give Doug his surname, provide him with a new passport, and introduce him formally to their family company. Additionally, he hired a skilled private detective to uncover how Doug ended up in the orphanage. The detective's findings arrived within weeks. As Mr. Greenspan suspected, Alejandro had brought Doug to the orphanage and had paid the headmaster handsomely for his silence. Determined to seek justice, Mr. Greenspan used his connections in the prosecutor's office to ensure the headmaster and all his staff were either fired or imprisoned for their cruel treatment of the children. The orphanage was subsequently closed, and the children were relocated to better facilities. Meanwhile, Doug started to feel normal again. He left the abandoned house and gave his former neighbours a generous gift of money, ensuring they remembered him as a benefactor and friend. Doug himself soon began his first apprenticeship. His father began to take him to the company almost every day, so that the guy would gradually get used to what would be waiting for him when he completely transformed from a homeless guy into a confident and knowledgeable businessman. Doug was glad to become a part of Mr. Greenspan's family, especially as his stepmother Helen took the appearance of her husband's native son quite calmly. She was a wise woman and understood that her husband's happiness was as important as her own. Little Ellie, learning that she had an older brother who had saved her, began to idolize Doug. She often called him a hero and enjoyed playing with him, pretending to be a bird or a brave pilot on his shoulders. Surprisingly, Mary was the only one upset by Doug's life changes. Learning that his father was a well-known businessman, she became sad and distant. "Mary, what happened?" Doug asked, puzzled. "Has anything changed between us? Are you worried I might leave you now? That I'm not poor anymore? I promise you, I will always love you, regardless of your status." Mary affectionately kissed him, but her eyes remained sad. "No, Doug, it's not about you." She tried to explain, but always stopped short. "What is it?" Doug insisted. "Tell me, what's the problem? Don't you love me anymore? Don't you want to be with me? Why? Don't I deserve to know?" Mary just cried, unable to hold back her emotions. "I wish I could tell you everything," she sobbed, "but I can't. I can't." A rift had certainly grown between them. After this conversation, they started seeing each other less frequently. Doug realized that he would lose his beloved Mary forever if he didn't take decisive action. Convinced of his plan, Doug bought a beautiful diamond ring for his future bride. He wanted to propose in a special romantic way, but first he needed to ask her out on a date. However, Mary's phone was unreachable, no matter how many times Doug tried. He began to worry when he suddenly received a disturbing message. It was a picture of Mary tied to a chair, crying, with a gun to her head. The caption below the photo read, "Come alone to the industrial zone. If you tell the cops or your father, your woman won't live." There was the address where Doug needed to go. The young man was ready to blast off at the same minute, but still, he realized that he couldn't do so without his father's advice in this situation. Acknowledging the risk he was taking, Doug went to his father's office and explained everything. "Show me the photo," Mr. Greenspan requested. His son dutifully opened the file on his phone. "How long have you been seeing this girl?" Mr. Greenspan asked with astonishment. "About 6 months. We met when I was just a homeless man," Doug replied, looking at his father in confusion. "Did Mary ever talk about her parents? Did she tell you about their occupations?" Mr. Greenspan asked cautiously. "No," Doug shook his head, "only that she ran away from home because she didn't want to yield to her father's wishes." Hearing those words, Mr. Greenspan began to pace the room. He couldn't believe his son had fallen for such an obvious trick. "Dad, explain to me what's going on." Doug was confused. "How are we going to save Mary?" Mr. Greenspan paused before his son and quietly said, "I suspect that Alejandro planned your fiancé's kidnapping." "What?" was all Doug could utter. "Why do you think that?" "Now is not the time. I'll explain everything later. Here's what we're going to do now." An hour later, Doug and his father were speeding along a rural road, drawing closer each minute to an abandoned industrial zone filled with old, neglected warehouses and garages. Upon reaching their destination, they received a call. A mechanical voice, distorted by a special program,
curtly informed them that Doug was about to be met. However, when Doug stepped out of the SUV, he didn't expect to be surrounded by an entire squad. "Hey, puppy, couldn't do without your daddy, could you?" Alejandro smugly asked Doug, as he and Mr. Greenspan were led into the vast warehouse. "Where's my fiancé, you jerk?" Doug asked grimly. "What have you done with Mary?" Alejandro pretended not to understand. "Who's Mary? Is this the girl you're talking about?" The next moment, one of Alejandro's guards rolled out an old office chair from a closed back room. Mary was tied to it with tape and rope, sobbing and whimpering. "Alejandro, don't be foolish. Let the girl go," said Doug's father as calmly as possible. "She's not guilty of anything. Furthermore—" "What? You haven't told your idiot son anything yet?" Alejandro sneered, then turned to Doug. "You've done well, boy. You've charmed my daughter to the point that she defies her family's rules. My rules." As he said these last words, Alejandro's eyes flared like a wolf ready to attack. "What do you mean?" Doug demanded, his heart torn between hatred for Alejandro and pity for the tormented Mary. "This poor girl isn't Mary at all. I believe that's how she introduced herself to you, isn't it?" Alejandro glanced at him caustically, then continued triumphantly. "This is my daughter, Becky Plano. She's going to marry the son of an old enemy, you. Do you think I would allow such a mismatch, especially considering that I already had the perfect fiancé for Becky in mind? Unfortunately, she ran away from home upon learning she was to marry Arthur this winter. She even changed her name and worked in the middle of nowhere. Did you really think I wouldn't find you?" Alejandro said, and painfully squeezed his daughter's shoulder, looking into her eyes questioningly. Mary screamed from the pain. "Don't you dare harm her, you brute!" Doug shouted, trying to rush to her side, but was immediately stopped by a couple of burly men. "Let's cut to the chase, Alejandro. What do you want?" Mr. Greenspan asked, struggling to contain his anger. "Now, that's a sensible approach," murmured the satisfied man. "I want to collect the full price from you, Anthony, from you and from my son-in-law." "You're not going to calm down, are you?" Mr. Greenspan asked him icily. "Let me guess. I'll give you half of my company again, along with the shares?" Alejandro, however, only shook his head negatively. "No, half isn't enough for me now. You and your son will give me everything you've got." "And if I refuse?" asked Mr. Greenspan, also calmly. "That's your right, but then I'll kill both my negligent daughter and your scoundrel of a son for blowing her head off and letting her believe that she can have any other life than the one I have chosen for her." "You wouldn't dare do that!" Doug stepped forward. "And Dad, I'm ready to sign whatever is required of me, just so long as Mary stays alive." Mr. Greenspan looked at his son carefully, then nodded. "All right, son. I can't lose you again." "Great," stretched out a happy Alejandro in anticipation of making the most lucrative deal of his life. "What about Mary? Are you going to let her go?" Doug asked Alejandro. "Of course," the man lied. "What do I need her for? She's a traitor to me and her mother from now on. I won't let her on my doorstep." Suddenly, strange sounds echoed from behind the warehouse wall. It took Alejandro a split second to realize they were police sirens. "You scoundrels!" he shouted angrily, aiming his gun first at Doug, then at his father. "Now I'm going to turn you both to dust. I don't know whom to start with." At that moment, a SWAT team burst into the warehouse, shouting loudly, "Everybody stay where you are! Everybody down!" Minutes later, all the criminals were arrested. Doug looked regretfully at Mary, who was being examined by the medics. They were preparing to take her to the hospital. "Mary,
Becky, I don't care about your real name and about your father, Doug said, taking her hand. I will love you no matter what. Doug, beloved, I really didn't think you would find me, the girl responded in a weak voice. When I realized you might get hurt, I was so scared that I was ready to part with you, just so you wouldn't be in danger. If something had happened to you, Doug, I wouldn't have survived it. Doug wanted to say more to his beloved, but the doctors asked him to step back. They were going to take Mary to the hospital. Don't worry, son, the doctors will take care of her. His father consoled him. At first, I thought Mary, or Becky, knew everything, but then I realized she didn't need to. She's not like her parents, and she's incapable of betraying the man she loves. I know, Dad, Doug replied tiredly. I don't care who her parents are. I'm going to marry her. I love her, Dad. Mr. Greenspan only smiled at his son and patted him on the shoulder. 2 weeks later, when Mary was discharged, she accepted Doug's proposal with tears of happiness in her eyes. The wedding occurred on the seashore, and it was a stunning event. Doug received an excellent education and became a successful businessman. Over time, he assumed control of his father's company. Mary completely disowned her father, who was imprisoned for life. She changed her name, thereby burying her past. Now, Mary is raising 3 children, born from her happy marriage to Doug. Every day, Doug thanks God for giving him the opportunity to find his true family and the chance to find the closest and most cherished people to him. Heavy leaden clouds blanketed the entire sky. Autumn had stopped playing with summer and fully asserted its rights. A hard rain was falling with no sign of stopping soon. Despite it was only noon, it felt like evening. Doris used to adore this weather. In the orphanage where she lived from the age of 10, she loved sitting at the windowsill in the farthest corner of the corridor. This was her private sanctuary. During unpleasant weather, she liked to nestle there hidden from prying eyes, with a book of fantasy stories, diving into the enchanting world of magic. Outside there could be a bitter rain or a winter blizzard, but inside it was always warm and snug. During these moments, Doris felt an incredible sense of calm and protection, reminiscent of her early childhood, when she had a family. She remembered her mother as young and beautiful, always smiling. Doris pictured her in a light, white dress, with small polka dots, blonde curls cascading over her shoulders, and lips accentuated with lipstick. Her mother worked at the pastry shop, often bringing young Doris cream-filled pastries or croissants. At work, she was valued and loved for her easygoing personality. Doris's father was a skilled mechanic at a factory. Tall, broad-shouldered and vivacious, he loved lively gatherings. They spent their spare time like any other family, going to movies or parks. He would carry his daughter on his shoulders, her tiny arms wrapped around him in a mix of fear and joy, knowing he wouldn't let her fall. Her parents were a sociable couple, often hosting friends late into the night. These gatherings ended with a chorus of loud songs, much to the neighbours' chagrin. Doris couldn't pinpoint when their lives began to change. Over time, some guests couldn't stand after the raucous parties. Mornings often revealed snoring bodies reeking of alcohol, a kitchen table littered with forgotten snacks, and a floor lined with empty bottles. Her mother seemed to care less about her appearance, applying thick powder to mask her puffy eyes. She'd wear clean, albeit unironed clothes, and trudge to work. Her father, even worse, was often unable to think or move in the morning. His frequent absences finally led to his dismissal, despite his talent and merits. Her mother was shouldering the entire family's burden, her once sparkling eyes devoid of their former light. All day, Doris's father did nothing but scold everyone, blaming them for his misfortune and drowning his sorrows in drink. It pained the girl to witness her parents' steady decline, but she was powerless to change the situation. Money was scarce, and soon Doris's classmates began to mock her worn-out clothes and derisively call her alcoholic's daughter. But unfortunately, the mother, weakened by alcohol too, couldn't endure such a life for long. One day, after a particularly hard day, she got drunk and never woke up. The doctors attributed her death to alcohol poisoning. Doris vividly remembers mourning her mother near her coffin. Now, her family essentially gone because her father had become a stranger to her. After the funeral, he spiraled further into his addiction, rarely sobering up. It was unclear where he got the money for alcohol and tobacco, but Doris never saw her father sober again. She would leave for school in the morning while he was still passed out on the sofa and return in the afternoon to find him already in the kitchen, setting up for another evening of drinking. He paid little attention to his daughter. Alcohol had transformed him into a zombie-like figure with a blue face, wandering eyes and shaking hands. However, this didn't last long. One day, the girl returned from school to a shocking scene. A fire truck and an ambulance were parked near their entrance. The air was thick with the smell of burning, and around 30 bystanders were chattering loudly, pointing at what used to be their window. All that was left was a black charred hole, like a portal to hell. Her drunken father had fallen asleep with a lit cigarette, burning down the apartment and suffocating in the process. This is how Doris ended up in the orphanage. The constant noise and commotion of the orphanage wearied the quiet girl, who was still reeling from 2 funerals. A secluded spot by the window shielded her from the bothersome attention of the staff and other children. That's when she began to love this kind of weather. This gave her hope for the future. The weather would eventually calm and the sun would shine again. But now she was on the other side of the window, and the weather evoked entirely different emotions. The cold wind was furious, attempting to rip off her simple polyethylene raincoat that lay over a light plain coat. It was chilling her to the bone. Her faux leather boots were soaked, making an unpleasant slapping noise with each step. Doris trudged through the pouring rain down the grey city street, following wherever her gaze led. The few passers-by, huddled under umbrellas, paid her no mind as they rushed to get out of the damp. Cars were indifferent to pedestrians, splashing them as they sped through puddles. Doris's palms and knees were completely numb and lacking sensitivity. She needed to find somewhere warm, even if it was just an entranceway. Doris circled several buildings, but each one was barred by the cold indifference of a code lock. A brightly coloured supermarket facade appeared in the distance. It was a place to warm up and dry off. A wave of warm air greeted Doris as she stepped inside. The young woman meandered through the aisles lined with goods in brightly coloured packages, designed to entice shoppers. She didn't take a basket. What was the point? The only things in her pocket were a jingling handful of coins and 2 small paper bills. She'd have to live on them for a while, until she could figure something out. Suddenly the baby moved within her. Doris stroked her belly, trying to soothe him. "It's okay, baby." But her mind raced. How could it possibly be okay? With just 3 months left until the birth, she found herself jobless, penniless, and without a profession. Every potential employer took one look at her belly and turned her away. Even the lowest-paying jobs were out of her reach. And, understandably, no one wanted to hire an employee who would soon go on maternity leave. The situation was a stalemate. She used to laugh at the over-dramatized TV shows where the main character faced insurmountable problems all at once. She marveled at the wild imaginations of the screenwriters who came up with such intricate plot lines. She never thought such things happened in real life. And of course, she never imagined that she could find herself in such a situation. When did it all start? Probably with Claire. Claire was a carefree girl of Doris's age who ended up in the same orphanage during high school. Her mother was deprived of parental rights, but the girl did not grieve her too much. She was more bothered by the sudden loss of freedom she had enjoyed living with her mother. The nimble Claire ran away a few times. However, after each runaway, she always returned. She was entirely different from Doris, but she chose her as a friend for some reason. Claire often boasted about her past life, filled with parties, admirers, and their gifts. She was particularly fascinated by the material aspects of life. Before bedtime, Claire would share her dreams with Doris, about becoming a model and earning a significant amount of money. She admired the model's glamorous and seemingly effortless lifestyle. Her ambition stemmed from her confidence in her looks, which she believed made her suitable for the modelling industry. Doris concurred with her new friend's perspective. Restless, Claire couldn't wait to leave the walls of the state institution. Doris was hesitant about taking such a drastic step, her fears holding her back, but Claire was unyielding, persisting with her arguments. What's in store for us here? A mediocre school, followed by a monotonous job as a seamstress or a cook. But you could be a model, seen by the whole world. Let's go. Your life is out there. The allure of a bright, promising future stirred their young spirits. Eventually, Doris yielded to Claire's persuasion, and they left their predictable world for one filled with dreams and uncertainties. Thus, one day, these two naive young dreamers walked into a modelling agency. Doris was nervous, expecting ridicule and rejection. However, they were met with interest instead. Claire, with her striking and provocative appearance, knew how to showcase her best traits. She confidently strutted down the catwalk with an almost professional gait. When asked to wear a dress from the latest collection, she promptly, without any hint of shyness, changed into the fashionable outfit, enhancing her appearance even further. Those around her nodded in approval, some even applauded. Doris, however, couldn't act in the same way, as it went against her nature. She began to regret agreeing to this adventure. People from the modelling agency scrutinised her like an item at a fair, openly discussing her flaws. She's attractive, even more so than the previous girl, but why so stiff? She's like a block of wood. Claire didn't appreciate the comparison, believing herself to be incomparable to her friend. Deep down, the seed of envy began to take root. Meanwhile, Doris started pacing back and forth, vehemently denying that she slouched or hunched, yet her shoulders slumped as if defending herself from numerous glares. Eventually, she was given a break. A tall, well-groomed woman, apparently in charge, told Doris that she had to work hard if she wished to stay. "I see potential in you, but whether there is talent, time will show." Doris agreed, having no other option. She couldn't bear the thought of returning to the orphanage in shame. On one hand, she was fascinated by the backstage glamour, the beautiful clothes, and the attractive people. On the other hand, she disliked the idea of being a silent mannequin for others' clothes. Claire quickly befriended several models, paying little attention to Doris. 2 days later, Doris was walking through the podium more confident. However, she was yet to acquire the inner courage highly valued in the modelling business. Meanwhile, Claire was consistently flattering Katrina, who was in charge of the girls at the agency. She seemed to be trying to convince Katrina of Doris's lack of talent. At the end of the day, Katrina announced that Doris was unlikely to succeed as a model, but she could stay on as an assistant. Doris was relegated to cleaning, fetching costumes and running errands. She didn't complain, and even felt relief when the attention was no longer focused on her. The only person who couldn't stop watching her was the chief administrator, Hunter. Hunter took immediate notice of the quiet girl with an uncommon appearance. There were plenty of beautiful models around, each unique in their own way, but Doris had something special, a trusting and straightforward demeanour that was rare among the models. Hunter didn't miss an opportunity to wink at her, compliment her, express his sympathy, and advocate for her whenever he could. Thanks to his protection, Doris was given the room in the dormitory. While she felt embarrassed by his attention, she was also profoundly grateful. Having her own private space allowed her to enjoy solitude and silence after long, hectic days filled with the incessant noise and running around. As she lay in bed each night, her thoughts often turned to Hunter. She recalled his casual touches in the elevator, the way he kissed her hand goodbye. These gestures stirred a pleasant sensation within her, evoking a sense of longing. On her weekly day off, she found herself missing his warm smile and his playful gaze. One day, Hunter called unexpectedly, inviting Doris for a city stroll. The prospect of their meeting made her heart flutter with excitement. Her young soul craved the emotional thrill of new experiences. Seeing Hunter in a casual setting, she realized she had long been in love with him. The warmth of his strong hands and the allure of his sweet words stirred a tender excitement in her heart. Love swept her into its exhilarating dance, leaving her no respite, and Doris didn't resist. She wholeheartedly embraced this relationship. She thought as though the entire world was created just for them, and nothing could stand in their way. The news that Hunter was married only briefly confused the naive Doris, because Hunter quickly soothed her concerns, claiming that his marriage was only on paper and that he planned to file for divorce soon, to be exclusively and eternally with her. Everyone at work knew about their relationship, but tactfully remained silent. Only Claire looked at her ex-girlfriend with a sarcastic grin. She herself was already in full swing romance with a businessman. One time, Hunter became distant, citing heavy workloads and fatigue. Their meetings became less frequent and shorter. He started avoiding talks about the future, a stark contrast to his earlier promises of a prosperous life. And soon Doris realized that she was pregnant. The young woman welcomed her pregnancy, believing that Hunter would soon divorce his wife for her, as he had often claimed. Hunter, however, was taken aback by the pregnancy news. He started interacting with Doris only professionally, responding with irritation and rudeness to her attempts at private conversation. In addition, Doris noticed that he was now looking at another model, the way he had looked at her before. Doris refused to believe that Hunter had left her. She rationalized his behavior, attributing it to his workload and believing that he would become a kind and loving man again. She remained patient and hopeful as her belly grew, and then she saw Hunter leaving in his luxury car with a new girl, and the reality of her situation finally sank in. In the morning, she resolutely came to Hunter in the office to clarify their relationship, but he only rudely and coldly kicked her out the door. The following day she was laid off, accused of stealing a jewellery set. Doris wept, her tears smearing her cheeks, as she tried to assert her innocence. But the decision had been made. She had no doubt that Hunter, who sought to remove his former lover from sight, was behind this. Claire watched this chaos silently, relieved that her friend, a reminder of her past at the orphanage, would no longer be around. Katrina suggested that Doris leave amicably, avoiding involvement with the police. Of course, this meant she had to leave the dormitory. That's how, in that chilly autumn rain, she found herself in a store, seeking shelter to avoid the cold and potential sickness. The security guard began to watch her suspiciously. She had no shopping basket, but was visibly pregnant. For about 20 minutes, Doris wandered between the rows without selecting any items. Must be a thief. She's probably hiding stolen goods under her clothes, the guard thought, following her closely. Eventually, he approached her and asked gruffly, "Girl, do you need help choosing something?" Doris recoiled in fear, which only increased his suspicion. God, now I'll be thrown out of the store in disgrace, she thought. She went to the bread and cakes department and chose the most affordable bun. Although it cost her a few coins, she needed to eat. Even though she found it difficult to eat, she still forced herself to chew and swallow the vanilla-scented bun. It wasn't the child's fault for having a neglectful mother. The indifferent guard maintained a watchful eye on the drenched woman, quietly eating a bun by the cash register. There was nothing to do anymore. Doris had to go further, but where to? The disparity between the indoor warmth and the outdoor chill seemed starker. The biting wind seemed to be waiting for Doris at the exit, hitting her with a gust of frigid air and showering her with droplets. She entered a few small stores along the way, but the distrustful looks deterred her, and besides, she couldn't afford to purchase anything more. Little by little, the apartment buildings were left behind. Before Doris, a quiet realm of private homes stretched out as far as the eye could see. She'd never been to this part of the city. Enormous mansions were interspersed with smaller houses. There were no pedestrians on the rain-soaked street.
The young woman halted, uncertain of her next move. Should she turn back and wander the cold, uncaring streets? Or should she go on, in hopes of finding an uninhabited, abandoned house where she could shelter from the weather and collect her thoughts? Doris stopped suddenly as her gaze fell on the high wicket gate in front of a substantial house. It was slightly ajar, almost inviting her in. Without thinking, she went inside the yard and knocked on the front door. Unsure of what she would say next, Doris felt this was her only chance. "Who is it?" a pleasant male voice inquired. "Hello, my name is Doris. I noticed your gate is open. May I come in to speak with you?" she replied, realizing her words might sound odd, potentially alarming to a stranger. Surprisingly, the front door opened, revealing a tall, dark-haired man standing on the threshold. Doris's eyes were immediately drawn to the white bandage covering his eyes and making it difficult to determine his age. "I'm sorry, I'm not here to steal anything, don't worry. I just need a place to avoid the rain. May I come in to warm up and dry off?" It was impossible to discern the man's thoughts from his partially hidden face. Anticipating a potential rejection, Doris stood partially turned towards the exit. However, the man unexpectedly said, "Come in. There's a kitchen on the right. Let's have some tea." Navigating by touch, he moved deeper into the room, inviting the unexpected guest to follow. Realizing the man was completely blind, Doris kindly prepared a hot beverage. "My name is Sven. So what happened to you, Doris?" he asked casually, as if an old friend had visited. The blind host's unexpected hospitality touched the young woman. She was finally able to remove her damp outerwear and waterlogged shoes. The hot cup warmed her hands and her spirit. The stranger sitting across from her did not glare at her or insist on anything. The words came out of Doris's mouth by themselves. She shared her whole story openly. Her childhood in the orphanage, her work, her relationship with Hunter, and her pregnancy. "So you're expecting a child?" he suddenly asked with kindness in his voice. "You must be so happy." "Yes, happy," she sighed thoughtfully. He then revealed his longing for children. "And I always wanted children. My ex-wife got pregnant shortly after the wedding. I was so dreaming, so looking forward to this child, but at an early term there was a miscarriage. After that, there were no more successful pregnancies." His voice was tinged with sadness as he spoke. After a brief silence, he started to share his own story. He had owned a small plant for several years. 2 months prior, there had been an explosion in the lab while he was present there. A wave of hot chemical vapours had severely burned his face, particularly his eyes. The doctors were still uncertain if he would regain his sight. Soon after the accident, his wife, Bree, had promptly filed for divorce and property division. While Sven was hospitalized and struggling with depression, his ex-wife managed to seize most of their assets, including those to which she had no rights. Sven could not understand how Bree, once a cheerful and kind woman, had turned into a self-centered woman focused solely on money in just a few years after their wedding. Engrossed in his business, he failed to notice that his young wife had made new idle friends. Their life revolved around maintaining a lifestyle focused on gyms, beauty salons, trendy diets, supplements, and expensive self-development training. Eventually, she lost interest in her husband and their home. Unsatisfied with all this situation, Sven decided to reduce Bree's expenses to ground her in reality, but this only infuriated her. Their relationship soured further, and Sven's sudden disability clarified their who was who. Alone in a large empty house, Sven withdrew into himself. He dismissed all the servants, save for a maid who cleaned and did laundry on Thursdays. He always ordered food delivered to his house, and all day long he listened to music and audiobooks. His time passed monotonously and tediously, and he saw no hope or light in his future, both literally and figuratively. Doris felt sympathy for the unfortunate man. His kindness and sincerity towards a strange woman from the street, whom he couldn't even see, deeply moved her. Sven remained silent for a moment,
seemingly wrestling with a difficult decision. "Doris, I have a proposal for you," he said hesitantly. "Would you consider living here and posing as my wife for a while?" Doris was taken aback. Did all men have the same intentions? "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone defiant and ready to leave the house of this seemingly perverse man. Preferring the streets seemed a better option. "You've misunderstood me," Sven briefly explained. "I mean, would you act as my assistant in public and be my eyes? I have an important deal coming up, and I've begun to doubt my employees. I suspect my ex-wife has bribed them to take over my business. She isn't content with less, she wants everything. I need someone I can trust." Doris sighed with relief, her initial fears alleviated. "Why did I immediately assume the worst?" she thought. "Sven already has enough to deal with, and here I am with my foolish assumptions." "Thank you for the offer. I won't let you down," she assured him. Grateful for the temporary shelter, she began to care for the lonely blind man, preparing his meals, reading books to him aloud, and running errands. With her assistance, he was able to venture outside. Her gentle voice accompanied him everywhere, and her steady hand offered support. As Sven held her warm, graceful palm, he felt a reciprocal response that comforted him and signified her reassuring presence. Being alongside this man lifted Doris's spirits. His serene expression, insightful words, and firm hand provided her inner balance. His close presence enveloped her in a comforting sense of peace, making all worries and sorrows fade away or momentarily hide. As weeks turned into months, harmony pervaded their household, their relationship always maintaining a friendly boundary. However, parting hands became increasingly difficult as they sought to retain the warmth and trust a little longer. The day to sign the documents arrived, and for some reason, Doris felt far more anxious than Sven. They arrived at the meeting a bit early, and they entered the meeting room. Doris was struck by the sight of her former friend Claire, a bright star amidst the serious people dressed officially. Upon seeing her, Claire merely raised her eyebrows in surprise and whispered something to the woman on her right, who Doris suspected to be Sven's ex-wife. The ex-wife looked Doris up and down, grinning, and then whispered something to her neighbour, a burly man with a thick neck and broad shoulders, giving him instructions. The imposing stranger called Doris into the corridor for a conversation. "Doris, as I guess you're assisting Sven, right?" he muttered. Doris could only nod in response as she stared at him, unable to speak. "Excellent. I was right. I see you're going to be a mother soon. I suspect you could use some money? A lot of money," he continued, his intense gaze making Doris uncomfortable. "Just imagine, you'll have your own place and a bank account with enough money for 5 years of worry-free living. All you'll have to do is avoid mentioning the contract points marked with a pencil." Doris exhaled deeply, summoning the strength to break free from the unpleasant man's hypnotic gaze. "I'm going to read everything that's printed in it," she declared firmly, before striding resolutely into the office. She was trembling with indignation, and the details of the unpleasant conversation reverberated in her brain. Could she betray the blind man who had given her refuge? Wrestling with her conscience was not for her. Sven, hearing Doris, discreetly took her hand under the table and squeezed it. She responded in kind. The tension subsided, allowing them to focus on the task at hand. For about an hour, Doris read aloud everything written on the sheets in the folder in front of her. Sven listened, nodding occasionally and asking for certain paragraphs to be re-read. There were a few errors in the contract. Hearing the oddly worded phrases, Sven frowned and stood, ready to halt the negotiations. The others quickly scrambled to explain the discrepancies as simple typos. The issues were swiftly addressed, and the deal was sealed. Doris finally let out a sigh of relief, shaking off hours of stress as she leaned back in her chair. Then she felt a sudden, sharp pain. Clutching her stomach, the woman hunched over and groaned. "What's wrong?" Sven asked with concern, placing a comforting hand on her, A wave of warmth and compassion flowed from his palm, easing her pain. "I don't know," Doris replied, sighing with relief. "I'm not due for another 2 weeks. It might be a false alarm." But another wave of pain overtook her, leaving no doubt the contractions had started. Feeling her distress, Sven quickly called for help. "Quickly, call an ambulance. We need to get Doris to a couch." The room sprang into action, and within 15 minutes, Doris was in an ambulance on her way to the maternity ward. Between contractions, she felt a profound absence. It was as if she were floating in space without an anchor. It wasn't until she was in the hospital that she realized what part was missing. The comforting presence of Sven's hand. Waves of intense pain periodically washed over Doris. Everything hurt, including her thoughts. "Congratulations, you have a girl! Look how adorable she is!" The midwife showed the baby to Doris, helping her to take a closer look at her daughter. The baby, with her wrinkled red face and thin limbs, appeared incredibly beautiful to Doris. This was a part of her. This was the little girl she had carried for 9 months, who was so eager to see the world. "Hi," the new mother smiled at her daughter, who waved her tiny hands, trying to adjust to her spacious new world after the comfort of her mother's womb. Doris suddenly felt an unusual warmth and happiness, and her body felt light. But lying on the hospital bed, her euphoria faded, replaced by anxious thoughts about her future. She was no longer alone. The responsibility for her child weighed on her mind. She found herself longing for the home she shared with Sven during their 3 happy months together. But she knew that her time as his temporary assistant was up. And they hadn't agreed on anything more. It would be downright insolent to show up there with a child. What was she to do? A few days later, her doctor said to her during his rounds, "You and the baby are fine. Tomorrow we'll discharge you. Let your relatives come by 10 o'clock. Doris gave a sad smile, thinking, "Yeah, a whole crowd of relatives will arrive tomorrow." The next morning, an elderly nurse peeked into her room. "Doris, your husband is here for you. However, it's a bit early. He's waiting downstairs." Doris was in disbelief. Did Hunter dare to come to the hospital? What could he want from her? After everything she had been through, she didn't want to see or hear from this scoundrel. Living impoverished would be better than living with such a scoundrel. Filled with determination and indignation, Doris jumped to her feet. Now she would tell him everything. Frowning and mentally crafting sharp responses, Doris descended to the first floor. In the lobby, a man sat on a bench holding a large bouquet of flowers, a white bandage covering his eyes. Doris couldn't believe her eyes. Her heart fluttered with joy. "Oh, Sven, it's you! Good morning!" Her voice wavered with excitement. "Hello, Doris." Recognizing her voice, the man stood and presented the flowers. "Congratulations on the birth of your daughter." "Thank you very much." The new mother gratefully accepted the flowers, holding them close to her chest. "Have you chosen a name yet?" Sven asked. "Stephanie," she said affectionately, burying her face in the bouquet and inhaling its sweet scent. "Beautiful name," the man smiled, "and I've come for you." Doris held her breath, afraid to disturb this newfound happiness. Could this kind, strong man truly want to be with her? "I would be happy if you and Stephanie took my last name," Sven said, breaking the silence. Tears welled in Doris's eyes at his tender words, which she hadn't dared to hope for. "But you haven't even seen me, have you?" she whispered, still in disbelief. "I haven't," the man responded, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I feel like I've known you all my life, even before we met. You're my soulmate. I love you." Overwhelmed, Doris threw herself into his arms, crying. "I love you too. You are the best man in the world," she whispered in his ear. They held each other until the nurse interrupted their embrace. "Hey, you two, are you going to take the child or not?" Doris and Sven, laughing, finally broke their tight embrace. They returned home with the baby and soon got married. Sven helped Doris take care of the little girl, and, unusually, she would quickly calm down in his arms. But with time, the man felt his limitations more acutely. "Doris," he said to her one day, "I've decided to have the surgery. I'm willing to risk it to become a fully capable husband and father. The doctors can't guarantee anything, but I want to try." Doris hugged her husband, then carefully removed his bandage and lovingly kissed his face, marred with burn scars. "Just promise me, if it doesn't work out, you won't be upset. I need you just as you are," she whispered, pressing herself against him. On the day of the surgery, Doris was a bundle of nerves. She paced anxiously in the hospital corridor, approaching every passing medic in hopes of hearing some news. Finally, the doctor emerged with a smile and gently patted her shoulder. "The surgery went well. Don't worry, we'll remove the dressing in a week. Until then, he needs to stay here for observation." Relieved, Doris exhaled, though her nerves remained. She longed to sit beside Sven all night, holding his hand, but the doctor disagreed, and Stephanie wouldn't allow it. She'd have to be patient. A week later, Sven was noticeably anxious before the significant event, clenching and unclenching his hands in an attempt to tame his emotions. His fate would soon be decided, and the course of his future life would become clear. The doctor had reassured him, but Sven detected a lack of confidence in his voice. The man held his breath, attuned to the conversation and activities around him. "You can open your eyes, but slowly, please," the doctor stated. Hesitant, fearing disappointment, Sven clenched his fists and slowly opened his trembling eyelids. Bright light burst into his vision, blinding him momentarily. Except for a white spot, he saw nothing. But gradually, the world around him began to take on a hazy form. To his right was a short, bald man in a white coat. To his left was a pretty, blonde-haired young woman carrying a baby. Her face was lit with a radiant smile, and from her lips came the familiar, beloved voice. "How are you, dear?" Blinking to confirm the reality of this miraculous vision, Sven replied, "I never realized how beautiful you are." He reached out and gently took the woman's hand. Doris blushed, her eyesight not yet fully recovered, but the progress was encouraging. The sight did not return completely, but even this result pleased and inspired the man. To punish his ex-wife for her betrayal, Sven took her to court and reclaimed his unlawfully taken property. No lawyer could assist Bree. The truth was on Sven's side. Reinvigorated, Sven returned to work with renewed itch. One day during lunch, Bree appeared at his workplace. She barged into the office and, uninvited, took a seat in the visitor's chair. She crossed her legs seductively and looked at her ex-husband. She exuded elegance and glamour, fresh from the beauty salon, in anticipation of their meeting. "Hi, Sven. I'm so glad you recovered," she declared, and Sven realized that her perfect appearance and captivating voice no longer affected him. "What do you want?" he asked indifferently, observing the antics of the traitor who had left him in his darkest hour. "Why do you speak with me so harsh? I missed you," she replied, brimming with feigned goodwill. "When I was in the hospital, you didn't miss me much. You never even came to visit. Were you too busy with the lawyers?" he retorted sarcastically. Bree was unfazed by his biting remark. It seemed she was prepared for such a cold reception. "I was foolish then, but now I understand that I still love you, just like we were on our honeymoon. Remember how good we were together." Her cynical attempt to evoke the happy times of their past had the opposite effect. Sven simply frowned and shook his head sadly. "You can't step into the same river twice. Too much has happened." Ignoring his words, the ex-wife moved closer. Her barely covered chest threatened to escape the indecently deep cleavage. I'm still the same Bree, the one you loved and passionately kissed on those hot nights," she purred seductively. She attempted to embrace him and kiss him, but Sven firmly pushed her away. "Stop this circus," he said. "I now understand your capabilities. Nothing can change. Everything is lost irrevocably." The young woman was taken aback. She had never faced such rejection, yet hope still lingered in her heart. "Please give me one more chance. I will prove my love to you," she pleaded, gazing earnestly into his eyes. Sven only smirked in response. "Did you ever love me? I don't recall such a thing. True love is different. I only came to understand this recently. I love another woman." Bree's expression quickly shifted, becoming one of contempt, as she hissed angrily. "Is it the simpleton with a child from an unknown man, and who's claiming it's yours?" Sven couldn't tolerate this. He stood up decisively and pointed towards the door. "Get out! You have no right to make such a claim. Don't ever come back here." Bree snorted scornfully and slowly left, swaying her hips. However, the stirred hornet's nest was not so easily calmed. "My plan didn't work. He chased me away," Bree complained to Claire, whom she recently befriended. "He says he loves your orphan friend." Claire pondered this. Her desire to spite her ex-friend arose from deep down in her heart. "We need to separate them, and I think I know how," she said, her tone full of implication. A familiar figure appeared on the small screen of the intercom. Doris recoiled from the unpleasant sight. "Hunter, how did you find me? What do you want?" she asked. He smiled kindly, holding a bouquet of fiery red roses. "Let me in, Doris. I need to talk to you. These are for you, your favourite," he said. Doris hesitated. Her husband wasn't home. She decided to step outside and talk there. But as the lock clicked open, Hunter burst into the house, ignoring her protests. He thrust the flowers into Doris's hands and made himself comfortable on the living room sofa. "Is that my daughter?" he exclaimed, noticing the little girl in the playpen. "That's not your daughter," Doris said firmly. "But I've calculated the time and I'm sure that—" Doris clenched her teeth and asked, "What do you want?" Hunter laughed, stood up and tried to hug her. "I realized I can't be without you." Doris pushed him away. He landed on the sofa and laughed. "Why so cold? You used to be different." Suddenly, Sven appeared in the doorway. He glanced at Hunter, the bouquet, picked up Stephanie and went into another room with her. The uninvited guest quickly made his exit. Seemingly, he had accomplished the task set for him by Claire. "What was he doing here?" Doris's husband asked angrily. The tone of the voice was ominous. "Honey, he stormed into the house, shoving me aside. I didn't invite him over or call him," she stammered in her defence, although she wasn't at fault. "How could he not have been invited if he was sitting in our living room?" Sven retorted. His baseless accusation deeply hurt Doris. "Sven, you're shouting at me for no reason. Nothing like that happened." Her voice now filled with indignation. Didn't he trust her at all? Blinded by jealousy, Sven continued to fume. "Perhaps I returned early and interrupted your rendezvous," he sneered. This was the last straw. Doris loved Sven deeply, but if he was going to continue doubting her, what was the point of being together? Without trust, their relationship meant nothing. That evening, they spent the rest of their time in silence, each nursing their hurt feelings. It was the first big disagreement in their married life. The morning didn't elevate their strained relationship. Sven went to work without saying any words and spent the day troubled by these memories of Doris's audacious former suitor, who had acted like he still owned her. Could it be that her feelings lingered, since she hadn't shooed him away? These thoughts filled him with bitterness and unease. Then it hit him. He could check the security camera footage. The man's nervous excitement made it difficult to operate the keyboard initially. What would he discover? Betrayal? After reviewing the footage, he couldn't help but grin with relief. He had been a fool. How could he doubt his beloved wife? Everything was crystal clear. Now, he needed to enhance their home security to prevent such incidents in the future. However, first and foremost, he had to apologize to Doris. "Oh, Doris, my joy, how I love you!" With this sentiment in his heart, he returned home, picking up a large bouquet of lilies and the finest cake he could find at the bakery. Now he would kneel and beg for forgiveness from his faithful wife. But the house was unusually empty. Pride forced the woman to take the child and leave, no longer feeling welcome. Again, Sven plunged into those feelings when he had languished alone with his depression. Total misery, and he blamed himself for this. Doris's phone was disconnected, and Sven had no idea where to find her. His heart was torn apart. His hasty conclusions and cruel accusations had deeply hurt his wife, forcing her to take the child and leave. He needed to act fast. Sven questioned all the neighbours for information, but to no avail. Doris had no acquaintances in the city to whom she could turn. Sven went to the modelling agency where she used to work, yet they knew nothing. He even visited the orphanage where Doris grew up, but found no clues there either. No one could assist him in his search. Late at night he returned to the empty, lifeless house. Exhausted, he collapsed on the living room sofa, unable to bear the thought of spending the night in their marital bedroom. After a sleepless night of worry, Sven set out at dawn to continue his search. He decided to scour social assistance institutions, hoping to find some trace of his family. One by one, he visited homes for people in difficult life situations, but found no trace of the woman he was looking for. As night approached, there was only one place left to check. With little hope, Sven arrived there, fearing if he didn't find his wife and child. "Yes, there is a woman named Doris here," a shelter worker told him, leading him to the room where she'd been staying since the day before. Doris sat on a narrow bed, gently rocking their daughter Stephanie in her arms and humming softly. All the eloquent apologies Sven had prepared during his search instantly left his mind. He could only fall at her feet and bury his face in her lap. He sat there for a while, not daring to look at his wife. It was only when she gently touched him that he stirred. Doris stroked his head and whispered, "What's wrong, Sven?" He raised a guilty gaze to her and said, "Please forgive me, love. I was a fool. Can we please go home?" Doris gave him an affectionate smile. Of course, she forgave him immediately. True love doesn't hold grudges. A couple of months later, the man arrived at his office in a light-hearted and happy mood, but he was met with an unpleasant surprise. His ex-wife was standing near the security. Sven was wary, expecting some sort of trick from her. However, he noticed that she appeared different. Her shoulders were slumped, and her usually regal posture was gone. Her face was gaunt, and bags under her eyes added years to her appearance. Her dark hair was simply slicked back, and there was something unsettling in her eyes. "Sven, I need to talk to you urgently." Her voice was no longer commanding, but pleading. "Let's go to the office," he responded concisely. Bree obediently took the offered chair and stared blankly in front of her, unsure of where to start. "What's the matter?" Sven asked, growing concerned by her distressed appearance. "A few weeks ago, the doctors gave me a terrible diagnosis. It appears my time is limited." Her voice was hoarse and shaky. With trembling fingers, she took a piece of paper out of her purse and handed it to Sven. He read it and sighed heavily, unsure of what to say. "You were right. God has punished me after all. I don't even have the resources for treatment now." She was silent for a moment before continuing. "I want to ask for your forgiveness. For everything." "If you're talking about the property, I've restored justice and returned what you had stolen," said her ex-husband, who genuinely felt sorry for Bree. Stripped of all pretense and artificiality, she was just an ordinary woman, tormented by illness. "You don't know everything," she said slowly. "In the first year of our marriage, I got pregnant and got rid of it, and then 2 more times. I didn't want children." Sven was silent, stunned by her confession. She had betrayed him from the start. "And I also wanted to separate you from Doris," Bree continued. Her gaze dimmed, and in a quiet, almost whispering voice, she added, "And I was the one who arranged that explosion. I wanted to be a widow. I wanted to take over everything as soon as possible. I now realize that I committed a sin, but at that time, my desire for power completely consumed me, as if a demon had taken over. Please forgive me if you can." The end of Bree's confession left the man speechless, grappling with the information. She watched him guiltily, awaiting his verdict. Finally, Sven managed to say, "I'll give you the money for treatment as much as you need, but I might never forgive you. You're a terrible person, a monster in human form." While this was happening, Stephanie slept peacefully, smacking her tiny lips in her sleep. Doris watched her with admiration. The baby was growing so quickly, developing new skills, not just day by day, but hour by hour. Doris wanted to take in and remember every first. Her first word, her first tooth, her first wobbly step. Sighing, the woman left the room and went into the living room. She turned on the TV quietly and picked up her unfinished knitting, a small pink cap for Stephanie. Sven came over and sat on the sofa, hugging his wife. "Are you watching those fairy tales again?" he asked, teasing her. Doris smiled warmly. "Yes, I've loved fiction since I was a child. And isn't our life like a fairy tale? I'm fortunate enough to meet you." Saying this, the woman tenderly kissed her Prince Charming. Outside, the rain fell softly, lulling the loving couple gathered around the family hearth. They were certain, now more than ever, that after the storm, the sun would surely return, warming them with its rays. The snow fell quietly all night, covering the chilly ground with a soft, downy blanket. In the morning, outside the window, there was some rustling and some fiddling. It was a flock of tits on the windowsill, eagerly awaiting their daily feed. Around November, Erin started feeding them regularly with a handful of seeds. The birds quickly became accustomed to it, and every day they would come for their share. When the birds saw their food provider through the window, they became animated. One of them tapped twice on the window with its beak as if to say, "Open up, we're here already." There were no sunflower seeds available, so the young woman used sliced bread from dinner. The tits happily accepted this simple treat and enthusiastically began to peck at it. As the woman watched their lively activity, vague memories from her distant childhood started to resurface in her mind. Once upon a time she used to prepare a simple treat for herself and her younger brother, Cooper. They would slightly wet the bread and sprinkle sugar on top. The resulting makeshift cake would crunch between their teeth, sugary but delicious. Sweets were a rarity in their house. Sometimes their mother's guests, mostly men, would spoil the children with candy or chocolates. Erin remembered a time when their apartment still retained the freshness of recent cosmetic repairs. A lacy doily adorned the dresser and a new TV stood in the corner. Her mother Helen was perfect then, with thick, shiny blonde curls cascading over her graceful shoulders. She wore a stunning white chiffon dress with blue flowers, which complemented her sparkling cornflower blue eyes. Her boyfriends smelled of tobacco and pleasant cologne. One of them, Alan, had lived with them for a long time. He had a kind smile on his freckled face and was always cracking jokes, making him a good man in the little girl's eyes. Alan was skilled with his hands and could fix anything. There wasn't a single wobbly door or malfunctioning switch in the house. Even their old washing machine started working again, thanks to his expertise. Little Cooper was delighted by Alan's collection of tools, such as various screwdrivers and soldering irons. He would stick close to the man, admiring his craftsmanship. Alan would also not tolerate dirty dishes and made sure the children were fed on time and dressed cleanly. However, her wayward mother disliked moralizing and constantly referred to him as a bore and a tyrant. She craved lightness and a holiday every day. Disputes between them became more frequent and louder, foreshadowing the inevitable end of their relationship. One day, Alan's bag of belongings disappeared from the pantry, along with his tool case. With them, the coziness and balance of the house vanished. Erin's mother became untethered, partying excessively. Noisy gatherings would often last late into the night in their house. Sometimes the woman wouldn't even come home to sleep. On those nights, Cooper would climb under the blanket with Erin, seeking comfort. The elder sister would whisper to him long tales about the evil witches, fearless Red Riding Hood, and hard-working dwarfs. During one of these troubled periods, Helen approached their neighbour, Mrs. Gordon. She gave her a spare key to the front door and requested that she occasionally look after her children. Besides, she poured out her complaints about life and the lack of money. Mrs. Gordon, a tall brunette with a perpetual perm, worked as the head of the personnel department at a factory in the city. With her help, Helen managed to secure a job as a cleaner there. Mrs. Gordon had no sympathy for her drunken neighbour, but she felt sorry for her children. Getting a stable job, unexpectedly for everyone, Helen calmed down and settled down for a while. It seemed like she had finally regained her senses, and everything would be fine in their lives. And then Mindy, the funny-eyed little girl, was born, and she immediately became everyone's favourite. Even the strict neighbour couldn't resist humming cheerfully to her whenever they encountered each other. The father of the child, like the fathers of Erin and Cooper, was unknown. The children had long stopped asking their mother about their father, as it only irritated her. And despite everything, they loved her dearly. The woman once again resembled the tender and caring mother from before, showering them with hugs and kisses, singing lullabies, and frying pancakes on weekends. But soon enough, Helen grew tired of the role of a responsible head of the family. The cycle of cavaliers and drinking buddies resumed. The new guests reeked of alcohol and had a stale, unwashed odour. Blue tattoos peeked out from under their t-shirts. At best, the children received indifferent glances. At worst, they were scolded. And the present friends of their mother never brought the children any gifts. The care of Mindy was fully transferred to the older children, with Erin bearing the majority of the burden on her fragile shoulders. Money was extremely scarce. To keep up with everything, she had to occasionally skip school, but her natural ingenuity and inquisitive mind helped her maintain good academic performance. Teenage interests took a back seat, and her few girlfriends disappeared from her life. Her mother seemed to have tried drowning herself in booze to numb her soul in an alcoholic frenzy, even if only temporarily. She completely neglected her appearance. Her unwashed hair turned grey, wrinkles lined her face, and heavy bags under her eyes were shades of blue. She increasingly became unable to work. Many times Erin substituted for her and cleaned floors to prevent her mother from getting fired. And then Helen became pregnant again and openly admitted that she decided to keep the child only for the sake of the allowance. Every day she sat on a porch with a bottle of cheap beer, sipping the foul-smelling warm liquid and staring at a single point for hours. Erin had to work hard in Helen's place
more and more often. Balancing studying, working, and taking care of her younger siblings was incredibly difficult. Thankfully, Cooper took on some responsibilities, and in Erin's absence, he would prepare a simple dinner. Usually it was boiled pasta or porridge, but nevertheless, his older sister always praised the 12-year-old boy for his help. By that time, Mindy was almost 6 years old. That day, Erin returned from school and noticed an ambulance near their house. Hurriedly coming into the house, she froze in horror at the sight before her. Helen lay on a medical stretcher, her face deadly pale, covered in drops of cold sweat, and a pool of blood visible on the nearby floor. "What happened?" the girl whispered, frightened, as she knelt down beside the stretcher. Mummy, my dear, what's wrong with you?" "Your mother is experiencing massive uterine bleeding. We need to get her to the hospital immediately," replied the paramedic. Erin quickly decided, "I'm coming with you. I won't let her go alone." The paramedic, rushing, nervously responded, "No, children are not allowed in the ambulance. It's against regulations." Erin was deeply concerned about her mother, knowing that she wasn't very young, so she was determined not to back down. "Please, I beg you, I won't interfere," she pleaded with the stern doctor, tears streaming down her cheeks. Softening upon seeing her pleading eyes, the paramedic waved his hand and said, "Okay, I don't have time to argue, let's go." And he took hold of the stretcher handles. At the hospital, the girl was given shoe covers and allowed to wait in the corridor near the operating room. There was a buzz of activity. No one paid attention to Erin. Doctors hurried into the operating room and interchanged phrases. "A 45-year-old woman. Placental abruption. Massive bleeding." After some time, a weary doctor emerged from the operating room. Erin's heart clenched with anxiety, fearfully awaiting the medical verdict. The man sympathetically placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "Stay strong, girl. We did everything we could, but it was too late. Your mother passed away." He paused for a moment, allowing her to grasp the sad news, and continued, "The child was saved. You now have a healthy brother." It felt as if something heavy and soft had struck the girl's head. Her vision darkened, and breathing became difficult. Time and space seemed to cease to exist. "Mummy, my poor mummy!" Tears streamed down Eric's cheeks like a hailstorm. A woman in a white coat snapped her out of her daze, asking, "Are you feeling unwell?" Erin took a deep breath and responded with a shaky voice, "I'm normal, thank you, but I don't know what to do next." An elderly nurse approached and said, "Next, you should give me your father's phone number." "I don't have a father," Erin whispered, feeling bewildered. "Well, do you have a grandmother or any older relatives?" The girl simply shook her head and said, "Only my younger brother and sister." A compassionate woman sat down next to her and said, "The body will have to be taken away and buried." Erin couldn't help but shudder at the word body. It was her mother, the woman who had loved her, sung lullabies to her as a child, and comforted her when she cried. The nurse felt sorry for the orphan and tried to offer some help. "Go outside, down the street into the archway and into the yard. You'll see a sign there that says Ritual Services. They'll give you all the information you need." Erin suddenly looked up at the nurse and asked, "And when can I pick up my brother?" The woman looked at her closely and asked, "How old are you?" Erin slowly replied, 17. The woman sighed and shook her head sadly. "He will go to a baby home." Erin's eyes filled with a glimmer of hope as she asked, "When I turn 18, can I take my brother then?"
I don't think so, the nurse replied. Babies are usually adopted quickly. You better think about yourself. Maybe you will be sent to an orphanage too. This cruel but honest answer left Erin speechless. The thought of being separated from her brother and sister shattered her world, and indeed, no one will understand that they have all long been independent, and Erin is ready to work day and night only if they are not separated. Well, we have neighbours and other options, she tried to explain, but then stopped herself. The nurse simply shrugged her shoulders and remained silent. The funeral home assured her that everything would be taken care of, and presented her with a hefty bill. It made Erin's soul feel even heavier. On the way back, she couldn't stop thinking about how she would break the sad news to little Mindy and sensitive Cooper. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she didn't even notice how she arrived at her neighbour's house. The neighbour was already waiting for her. So, how is your mum? Erin had to say it out loud for the first time. Mum died. She managed to squeeze out, her lower lip trembling. The woman reacted sympathetically and hugged Erin. The girl looked down, not wanting to go into details. She remembered the sad errands ahead and held out the bill in her hand. Mrs. Gordon, could you please help me? I only have half of the amount, which I was saving for graduation. I'll pay you back later. Of course, you can rely on me, Mrs. Gordon replied, taking the bill in a businesslike manner. As Erin stepped into the house, a joyful Mindy greeted her with open arms and shouted, Hooray! Erin is here! Cooper peeked out of the room, holding a textbook in his hand. Were you at the hospital? He asked, but froze when he saw his sister's face. What's wrong with Mum? Erin slowly walked into the kitchen and collapsed into a chair, exhausted. It felt as if 1,000 blankets had been thrown over her shoulders. The children followed her. Mindy stared at her sister with her big cornflower eyes, unable to understand why her kind Erin looked so upset. Cooper watched anxiously. Where is Mum? Mindy asked casually. Erin covered her eyes for a moment and let out a heavy sigh. Mindy? Mummy is gone. Her tired voice sounded muffled. Cooper, who had matured early, held his breath with a stoic expression. He understood everything perfectly. What do you mean, gone? The little girl asked in surprise. When will she return? Mindy asked, her voice filled with confusion. She flew away to the sky, Erin replied, remembering a scene from a movie where the death of a parent was explained to a young heroine. To the moon? Will she come back? Mindy bombarded her with questions. She won't come back, but she'll watch over us from above all the time, and we'll live together amicably. The childlike innocence in Mindy's words helped Erin gather herself. The responsibility for their future now rested solely on her shoulders. She tried to embrace both children, but Cooper pulled away and ran off. Erin knew it was better not to touch him at that moment, and let him be alone with his thoughts. A little later she entered his bedroom. The boy lay on the bed trying to hide his tear-stained face from his sister. Erin lay down next to him and hugged him, just like she used to do when she told him bedtime stories. It's terrible, and it's painful, Cooper, but I have you and Mindy. We're a family. We'll get through this shadow time together, won't we? She whispered to her brother. Meanwhile, the younger sister came into the room too and declared, Why are you both hiding from me? She climbed up and settled down between them. Cooper didn't mind. So they lay there, huddled together until nightfall. Erin told them old fairy tales, while the night light cast whimsical shadows on the walls and ceiling. It felt as if the three of them had entered an unknown world where daunting challenges awaited them, but together they would overcome any obstacles in their path. The next day, Mrs. Gordon made a quick trip to the funeral home, and the bill for the services was cut almost in half. Erin didn't mind. All she wanted was for the farewell to go as it should.
A day later, everything was ready. The funeral was simple. None of the drinking buddies or suitors showed up, perhaps because they were unaware. Only a few neighbours, Cooper and Erin, attended. It was decided not to take Mindy. The kind-hearted neighbours felt genuine sympathy for the orphaned children, even though the deceased was not pitied in her lifetime. They collected a small amount of money, enough to cover the remaining cost of the funeral services. Helen looked better in death than she had in life. Erin hadn't seen such a calm and peaceful expression on her face in a long time. It felt as if she would open her eyes at any moment and be amazed to find herself lying in a coffin. This absurd thought persisted in Erin's mind, making it difficult for her to control her emotions. Tears streamed down her face as she made her way to the cemetery. It only became a little easier when the coffin was put down on the bottom of the grave and the men with shovels started filling in with earth. The few people who had seen Helen off dispersed. The children embraced each other and silently mourned at their mother's grave. Their relationship with each other improved even more than before. Each knew their responsibilities. Every day, Cooper took his younger sister to kindergarten on his way to school and picked her up on his way back. He also helped around the house and did his homework in the evenings. Erin attended her classes, and in the afternoons she rushed to clean the factory. Thanks to Mrs. Gordon's patronage, she was able to get the job. Even Mindy stopped being cranky in the morning and started helping around the house. However, the thought of her newborn brother never left Erin's mind. "Where are you? What happened to you? Soon I'll be 18 and I'll try to find out where you are and how to get you back. Just wait for me. I'll find you," the girl longingly thought every night before going to bed. One evening, after finishing her cleaning duties, Erin returned home and found two unfamiliar women in their apartment. A short-haired brunette, wearing a dark suit and thick glasses, was sitting at a desk writing something. The other woman, a blonde in a mustard-coloured jacket over a black knit dress, stood in front of Mindy and Cooper. They were sitting on the sofa, looking like frightened animals. Evidently, the woman had just intimidated them. "Ah, there's Erin. We've been waiting for you," exclaimed the blonde guest. The warmth in her voice contradicted her cold official appearance. "My name is Mrs. Parker, and this is Mrs. Blake," the woman at the desk said, peering at the girl over her glasses. "We represent the Child Protection Service." Erin already understood what was happening, but a glimmer of hope for a positive outcome remained in her heart. Mrs. Parker continued, "We have received information about 3 underage children living here without supervision." "I'll be 18 in a few months," Erin hurried to clarify. "Honey, legally you are still a child for a few more months. Your family has experienced a tragedy, and the state is taking custody of you. We are here to help," the official explained, affectionate yet firm. "Pack your things, yours and the younger children's," she instructed. "But we are managing just fine. We're clean and have everything we need," Erin tried to prove their worth. The social worker shook her head condescendingly. Her gaze froze everything around her, and her tone didn't allow for objections. "Gather your things. There's nothing to discuss." "You can't just remove us like this, tonight." The older sister's nerves started to fray in despair and helplessness. "Not only can we do it, but we have to," the woman calmly assured her. "Please don't make us call for help or use force. It will only scare the younger children." With tears streaming down her face, Erin gathered their essential belongings, and the 3 orphans set off into the unknown. For a few days they stayed in one place with around 10 other children. The caregivers assigned them to a separate room, provided them with good meals, and left them undisturbed. Cooper and Mindy never left Erin's side. They were focused, yet calm. Erin had already accepted this situation and decided that they could wait for her adulthood in these conditions, as long as they were not separated. However, it turned out that they were waiting for distribution. 3 days later, a car with social workers arrived to pick up Mindy and Cooper, while Erin had to go to another orphanage. Her heart was torn by the crying of her little sister. Erin kissed her goodbye and vowed through tears that she would find them soon and take them away. Cooper silently experienced the parting, only uttering, "We will be waiting for you," as he got into the car. One piece of Erin's soul was taken away in an unknown direction, along with her brother and sister, and coldness settled inside. In the new place, Erin sat on the bed in the girls' bedroom for several days, feeling devastated and indifferent to her surroundings. The other girls showed little interest in the new arrival. In the orphanage, they had their own rules and little sympathy for each other. Some girls of the same age would mistreat and steal from the younger ones. Witnessing such incidents, Erin imagined that it could be her brother and sister, and one time she couldn't bear it and stood up for the mistreated child. From now on, she became the victim too. They would spoil her food in the dining room, stain her clothes, and complain to her teachers. Erin realized that her life would not improve, and complaining to the teachers would only make things worse. Finally, she dared to run away. It happened spontaneously. She simply walked out, wearing whatever she had on, through the gate that someone had forgotten to close. In her pocket, she only had an old button phone that belonged to her dead mother and a small amount of money she had saved up before ending up in the orphanage. To her great luck, a bus was pulling up to the bus stop 50 meters from the orphanage. The decision came suddenly. It felt like an eternity as she travelled somewhere far away without a plan. The jubilation of unexpected liberation was soon replaced by uncertainty about the correctness of her actions. As small, pretty houses with colourful roofs surrounded by greenery replaced the aesthetic high-rise buildings, the bus suddenly stopped at one of the stops, and the driver loudly announced, "The end stop." The bus unloaded its last passengers, turned around and drove away, leaving a dusty cloud behind. Erin found herself on the outskirts of the city. The unknown was both frightening and exhilarating, but she didn't want to go back. She couldn't go home either, as they would look for her there first of all. Her gaze fell on a road sign before the exit from the highway. It read, Lakeville. Memory is an amazing thing. Sometimes sounds, images, or conversations that were once accidentally captured and stored in the depths of the human brain resurface. This was one of those moments. Erin immediately recalled a conversation she overheard at the supermarket last year between two elderly ladies.
"It's a pity I no longer have the strength for my summer house. Ever since my Paul passed away, I haven't been there in 3 years. And it's such a nice little house with a small plot. Have you been to Lakeville Village? My house is the outermost house with a blue roof and blue shutters. My husband and I specifically painted it this way. To memorialize our honeymoon on Santorini Island." A plan formed on its own to settle in this summer house and stay there until she came of age. Erin took the money out of her pocket and counted it. The plan was immediately supplemented with another item. Finding a job was urgent. After about 15 minutes of walking along the forest road, the needed house came into view as a blue blur. Erin pushed the gate, which creaked and opened welcomingly. The neglect of the tiny plot and the uncared dwelling were striking. The path to the porch was barely visible through the grass, and the dusty sun-bleached shutters were closed and covered with ivy. As a precaution,
The girl knocked, but of course there was no answer. The door was locked. After some time, Erin lifted the dirty doormat and discovered a small key underneath it. The room inside smelled of dust and dampness. Without much hope, the girl pressed the switch on the right side of the door, and miraculously, a dim light bulb illuminated the space under the low ceiling. This stroke of luck inspired her to explore further. The old house consisted of one bedroom, a living room and a kitchen. However, everything necessary for a modest existence was there. A bed, a sofa, a table, chairs and a wood stove in the corner, along with various utensils. In the bedroom there was a dusty bookcase, indicating that the elderly woman and her husband were book lovers. Erin spent the entire day cleaning the house. In the evening, tired but satisfied, the girl sat down on the wooden porch, still feeling the warmth from the sultry day. Now her thoughts began to turn to her family. The image of her brother's longing look and her little sister's tearful face haunted her. Although Erin didn't fully understand how she would be able to reunite her family, she vowed to do everything in her power to return them. The next day, Erin started looking for a job. It was not an easy task. She tirelessly searched through ads in all available sources. Most job openings required a passport. After weighing the pros and cons, Erin decided to offer her services as a caregiver in the free ads section. Surprisingly, the next day her phone rang, and a cheerful female voice said, "Hello, I'm calling about the ad. My name is Brenda. Are you still looking for a caregiver job?" Erin quickly clarified, "Yes, but I live far from the city." To her surprise, the woman responded enthusiastically, "Excellent! And would you be interested in working from home? I have a bedridden husband who has been wanting to go to the village for a while. Of course, I promise fair payment, and I can even pay extra if needed." After a moment of thought, Erin agreed. "Good. Give me the address and I'll come to get acquainted and finalise the remaining details," Brenda said. 3 hours later, a red jeep pulled up to the gate. Brenda turned out to be a stunning brunette in tight pants and a bright red blouse. Her enhanced black hair, silicone lips, and unnaturally long eyelashes gave her the appearance of someone who had probably spent a lot of time in beauty salons. Erin's plain appearance, lack of makeup, and dark blonde braided hair seemed to meet the young woman's expectations of a caregiver. Brenda, fearful of getting dirty, looked around the modest dwelling with a hint of disgust. "Great. It's just right," she muttered, surprising the future caregiver. Erin's attempts to discuss Brenda's husband's condition and care didn't yield any results. The woman simply grinned and said, "Why worry? You'll get to know each other and discuss everything tomorrow morning." The next day, a specialised car arrived, and 2 strong orderlies carried the disabled man on a stretcher into the house. After placing a small bag with his belongings on the porch, they left without saying a word. The girl was now alone with an unknown man in a strange house. The new tenant was in his 30s, with a scruffy beard and an exhausted expression on his face. His chestnut-coloured hair was unkempt, untouched by a barber's hand for a long time. Sad grey eyes stared indifferently at the ceiling. "My name is Erin." The girl decided to establish a connection immediately and smiled warmly. The man reluctantly turned his head and observed the nurse for a moment. He didn't expect to see such a fragile girl in this role. Erin's long, dark blonde hair was neatly tied back in a ponytail. Her naive blue eyes radiated genuine concern and kindness. "Oh, she's just a girl. How can she help me?" he thought, and he hoarsely introduced himself. "Michael." Erin responded, "Pleasure to meet you. Your wife hired me, but unfortunately she didn't tell me anything about you." Michael grinned bitterly and sarcastically replied, "Not surprisingly. She doesn't know anything about me." Erin tried to imagine what it would be like for a once healthy and strong man to suddenly become helpless and dependent on others. She felt sorry for Michael. She sat down by the bed and asked, "Could you tell me what happened?" Her childlike directness and naivety won him over. No one had shown genuine interest in his well-being for a long time. Suddenly, he felt the urge to share his feelings with someone. Michael had owned a fairly successful construction business for many years. As he focused on growing his business, he never found the time to start a family. However, about 2 years ago, his parents passed away, one after another, and he was overwhelmed by an endless feeling of loneliness. The large house was suddenly abandoned overnight, and Michael had no desire to return to the place where he only encountered the echoing sound of footsteps and the faint rustling of curtains swaying in the draught. However, the dream of a strong and loving family still lingered in his heart. Soon, at a friend's birthday party, he met Brenda, and their passion swept them away in the rhythm of the tango. Despite warnings from acquaintances about Brenda's questionable character, Michael was enthralled by her. Their first meeting quickly led to their wedding. However, after the wedding, the veil of love slowly began to fade. Brenda was not suited for family life. She had no desire for children and preferred spending her time outside the home, away from her husband. Clubs, parties and shopping were the extent of her dreams. After a long day of work, Michael often returned to their lifeless house and warmed up a stale slice of pizza from the nearby pizzeria. And, to his great shame, he couldn't comprehend why he had married Brenda. Their relationship deteriorated, and Michael finally started speaking about divorce. To prevent losing her wealthy lifestyle, Brenda made promises to change herself. For a while, she attempted to be a quiet and domesticated wife. However, Michael sensed her insincerity, and the couple grew further apart. Then, 2 months ago, disaster struck unexpectedly. Michael was robbed and brutally beaten right on the doorstep of his office. Doctors managed to save his life, but the spinal injury left him disabled. His body became almost uncontrollable, and the few movements he could make were extremely difficult and caused excruciating pain. The doctor's prognosis was discouraging. The consequences of the injury would confine him to bed permanently. The attackers were never found. The security cameras were turned off that day, and there were no witnesses. Brenda only visited him at the hospital twice, mostly to discuss the future of the business. The company's employees complained about her interference in Michael's business. Her attempts to take over everything failed, as she lacked expertise in the construction industry. The company survived solely on past projects. With depression taking hold, Michael lost interest in everything. His world had fallen apart. Even upon returning home, things didn't get any easier. Brenda greeted him with a fake smile and tried to convince him to sell the business before it was too late. Furthermore, the young woman practically didn't hide the calls from her lover anymore. Michael felt physically repulsed by being under the same roof as her. He was ready to go anywhere, even to the ends of the earth. When Brenda proposed to move out of town, he agreed immediately. At this point, he no longer cared about anything. He was going there to die. "You'd be better off in nature. A nurse will look after you. As soon as I sell the business, I'll come to you right away. Let's sell the house too. Why do we need a 3-story building now?" Brenda reasoned. Michael remained silent. His disgust for his wife kept him from speaking. When Erin heard his story, she was shocked and wanted to help in any way she could, but she didn't know how. "Would you like me to cook something for you?" was the only thing that came to her mind. Michael smiled kindly for the first time. After his confession about his failed life, he suddenly felt light and free. "I want fried potatoes," he replied. And so they started living together. Erin skillfully took care of her mentee. She cooked, cleaned and washed. The man finally felt strong enough to at least try to improve his condition. He remembered everything the therapists had told him and slowly began to do exercises. Michael didn't want to burden her and made incredible efforts to move around, even though every movement caused unbearable pain. With the support of a cane, he could now take a few steps. Every step was agonizing, but he refused to give up. He didn't want to appear useless and helpless in Erin's eyes. With time, Michael had developed strong feelings for the caring and compassionate young woman, but he didn't know how to navigate these emotions yet. In the evenings, she would light candles, because the small lamp couldn't provide enough illumination, and they would read old books left behind by the elderly owner of the house. They would then engage in long conversations about various topics, and Michael would describe the countries he had visited. When they ran out of things to talk about, they sat together in silence, watching the strange shadows dancing on the walls. A fragile, spiritual connection grew stronger between them each day. The girl admired this intelligent and trustworthy man. One evening, she decided to share her sad story with him. Michael remained silent for a long time, processing the information, before simply saying, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." For some reason, the girl believed him. She realized that she had loved this man for a long time. Two lonely souls with tragic destinies were brought together. Some time later, Brenda arrived again, but this time she was accompanied by a strange woman who seemed to be her opposite. The woman was small in stature, wearing a black business suit and carrying a large leather briefcase. "This is the notary." Brenda casually introduced her to Erin at the gate, and her determined, bloodthirsty gaze revealed her intentions. Seeing Michael in bed, Brenda was taken aback. "Michael, you look good." Her tone couldn't hide her surprise and irritation. "Let's meet Anne Hubbard. She will help us with the document reissuance." "With the document reissuance? What do you mean?" Michael pretended not to understand her intentions. "Darling, we had a deal, remember? We've decided to sell everything while your business is still afloat. Then we'll have money for your further rehabilitation and our decent lives. But we have to hurry. The company's getting worse, and I've already found a buyer for the house. I'm suffering away from you, and I have to do all this work instead of taking care of you. So let's end this burden, and I can finally devote myself to you. And to save you the trouble, we decided it would be better to put it in my name, so I could do it. Honey, you and I have already discussed this, and you agreed to it." "I didn't agree to anything, and I'm not going to sign anything over to you." The husband's calm face infuriated the selfish wife. "But Michael, we discussed it, and I've arranged everything. I even brought a notary. You just need to sign." She persistently pressed him. "There will be no deals," the man firmly replied, leaning back on his pillow. The conversation with Brenda had worsened his already severe headache. "But you don't need all this anymore. You'll lie here for the rest of your life. But I'm still young. I still have to live." Brenda said it with anger, unable to control herself. "I've said to you everything I want to say." Michael closed his eyes, hoping Brenda would leave his temporary sanctuary as soon as possible. Brenda looked at the notary, silently pleading, but the notary shook her head. Biting her lip, the wife calmed herself down with visible efforts and tried to justify herself. "Michael, I'm sorry, I was just worried about you. That's why I snapped. Rest, my dear, rest. I'll come back later." And the official delegation left immediately. Before leaving, Brenda approached Erin closely and whispered, "Listen, maybe I forgot to mention when I hired you, but my husband's condition will only worsen. The doctors said nothing would help him. You don't have to try so hard. Just splash some broth in a bowl once a day, and I'll pay you more. A lot more. I hope you understand me properly now." Brenda
looked meaningfully into the girl's light-coloured eyes, and then she drove off in her fancy car, leaving behind the lingering scent of her expensive perfume. Erin shuddered at such admonitions, but quickly regained her composure. She wouldn't let Michael worry, especially after such an unexpected visit. The room still carried the heavy scent of Brenda's luxurious perfume. The girl opened the window wide, sat on the chair near the bed, and placed her palm on Michael's forehead. The man opened his eyes, and the headache slowly began to fade. "How fortunate I am to have you, Erin," he whispered tenderly, gently squeezing her narrow palm in his hands. He slowly brought it to his lips and kissed it softly. The girl smiled softly and said, "Let's have some tea." The next day, Erin needed to restock her modest food supplies at a small local store. Next to the shop there was an attractive 2-story house made of white brick and roofed with emerald green tiles. Several cars were parked in front, and there was sometimes a long line of people, some of them using crutches. In a store, Erin asked the saleswoman about that house and its inhabitants. "Ah, it's Bernard's house. He is our witch doctor, our bone setter, a remarkable man," replied the ruddy saleswoman. "Many people seek his help. He cured my brother-in-law's long-standing back pain," she continued while counting out the change. "Is it expensive?" Erin timidly asked. "Oh, not. Bernard never turns anyone away. He has his own principles. He takes as much as a person can give. I heard that one businessman even offered him a car after his son was healed, but he declined such a generous gift." Erin left the grocery store and went to that house. Seizing an unexpected opportunity, she was determined not to let it slip away. A flicker of hope ignited within her, warming her from within. An hour later, the last patient drove away, and Erin confidently pressed the doorbell. Almost immediately, a tall, wiry man in his 60s emerged. He had dark eyes and a hooked nose, and he wore a cotton shirt with loose-fitting, light grey pants that resembled a surgical suit. His strong hands resembled shovels and could probably bend a horseshoe effortlessly. "Hello, are you Bernard?" Erin's voice trembled with excitement. "Yes, I am Bernard," the man replied, his almost black, piercing eyes fixed on her beneath his bushy eyebrows. Erin, trying to be concise and not waste the healer's precious time, said, "I take care of a man. He is 33 years old, with a neck and head injury." Bernard nodded and said, "Bring him tomorrow at 9 o'clock. "We live nearby, on 5th Street, the last house," Erin added with large eyes pleading. The healer nodded. "OK, I'll drop by in the evening," he said briefly before disappearing into the courtyard. Around 7 o'clock, when the sun had already set behind the summer house, Bernard arrived. He carefully examined the new patient, probing his neck, head, and then moving down the spine to the coccyx. Michael cried out in pain at certain points. Erin sat in the corner, feeling like a sparrow in the cold, her heart aching with every sound of pain. Bernard murmured, "Yes, it's not too late. When was the injury?" 3 months ago, Michael replied. "I see," the healer said, attentively looking into the patient's eyes. He then asked seriously, "Do you want to live?" "Yes, I do," Michael answered with equal seriousness. It seemed that the two men understood each other. "It won't be easy or quick," Bernard stated. He turned to Erin and said, "Go out, girl, take an hour's walk." Obediently, Erin hurried out of the house, but her anxious chest prevented her from enjoying the walk. "Please let it work, Lord," she silently prayed. Erin anxiously waited by the leaning fence until Bernard emerged. He looked exhausted, his shirt soaked in sweat. "I'll come back tomorrow at the same time," he briefly informed her, responding to her unspoken question. He then walked leisurely back to his house. Within 2 weeks of starting treatment, noticeable improvements occurred. Michael's body became more responsive. The pain dulled, and he was able to walk with a stick. Each step and movement
tormented him less. Eventually, he was able to descend the porch steps and walk out of the gate. Slowly but surely, he made his way to the healer's sessions on his own. It initially felt like an arduous journey, but Bernard insisted on a consistent effort. Throughout the entire recovery process, Erin never left his side. Encouraged, she ran around the house doing chores each morning, and in the evening there was a long-awaited walk with Michael to Bernard's house. They would return late, holding hands and admiring the nature. Despite feeling tired, they chatted merrily, overwhelmed with happiness. Michael felt confident and started making work calls to stay updated. One day, feeling strong enough, he called a cab and went to his office. Seeing their long-absent boss, the delighted subordinates surrounded him, eager to shake his hand. "You look wonderful! You're finally back!" The man heard the genuine joy from all sides. Michael entered his office without knocking and saw Brenda sorting through a pile of papers with a stack of folders nearby. "What is it?" she asked, raising her head with a haughty and disgruntled look. But her expression quickly changed to surprise and a crooked smile. "Hello, Brenda." Michael anticipated her reaction and swiftly entered, leaning slightly on his wand. The woman emerged from behind the table, frantically thinking about what to do next. She looked her usual spectacular self, a white blouse with the top 2 buttons undone, a black leather tight skirt, and lacquered stiletto heels. Bright makeup complemented the look. It seemed as though she might stretch out, undo several more buttons, and spin around a pole at any moment. "Michael, what a joy! What a good influence country life has had on you! And it's all thanks to me," she exclaimed, quickly recovering from her surprise and attempting to hug her husband. "Yes, thanks to you," Michael grinned, pulling away from her. "What are you looking for?" "Michael, I'm trying to save our business. I'm sorting it out slowly," she replied, feigning reproach. "Our business?" Michael said sneeringly, going to the table and sitting down in his chair. "You don't have to worry anymore. I'm taking everything into my own hands and freeing you from such a burden." "Oh, Michael, I've been here for several months, day and night, working tirelessly while you're on vacation in nature." She pretended to be indignant and pouted her plump lips resentfully. "I've heard, Brenda, what you have been doing day and night. So, take your things from home, and I'll see you in court. Oh, and I finally met the girl of my dreams. She's the one who saved me." After saying this, Michael breathed a sigh of relief. He had finally said aloud what he had felt for a long time. The sultry brunette turned purple, realizing that she had nothing more to do there. "No, you will not get rid of me so easily," she thought angrily to herself and stormed out, slamming the door loudly. The office staff probably guessed what had happened in the director's office. They murmured approvingly and laughed as she left. This infuriated Brenda even more. Everything didn't go as planned because of this nasty Erin. Brenda couldn't suppress her rage any longer. As she sat in the car, she immediately picked up the phone and dialed the caregiver's number. "Ah, you ungrateful wretch!" she yelled into the receiver instead of greeting. "Who asked you to help him? I've already done almost everything. Persuaded my lover and his friend to attack Michael, and he agreed to sell the business. You stupid stuffed have ruined everything for me." After venting her anger, Brenda faltered, realizing that she had said too much, and hung up. Erin turned off the recording of the conversation and immediately sent it to Michael, as they had agreed. The man had an idea who was to blame for his misfortunes. Knowing his wife's explosive nature, he needed to provoke her to obtain evidence. Then it was a matter of technique: police, investigation, and court. Taking control The experienced businessman quickly established a workflow. Fortunately, it wasn't too late. He moved his beloved Erin to his mansion and made a marriage proposal. With the help of Michael's connections, they quickly discovered the whereabouts of Erin's younger brother and sister. The journey to the orphanage felt like an eternity, but finally, Erin would be reunited with her family. In the hall, Mindy and Cooper anxiously awaited her arrival, accompanied by a teacher. As soon as they saw their beloved sister, the children ran towards her with excitement and hugged her tightly. "Cooper! Mindy!" Erin couldn't contain her emotions any longer, and tears of joy streamed down her face. The younger sister, unable to speak, sobbed uncontrollably too, and even the boy, who had grown in the past 6 months, couldn't hide his teary eyes. Witnessing this heartwarming reunion was impossible to remain indifferent to. The orphanage employee discreetly wiped her own eyes, and Michael smiled with happiness. As Christmas approached, the entire family enthusiastically prepared for the celebration. Michael brought home a huge Christmas tree and, with Cooper's help, set it up in the spacious living room next to the fireplace. Everyone enjoyed in decorating the tree with colourful balls, sparkling icicles, and shining garlands, turning it into a magnificent sight. They brainstormed the menu for the festive table, ordered gifts, laughed, and played around. Amidst these joyful activities, one thought continued to occupy Erin's mind. Where was her youngest brother? What had become of him? Sensing his beloved wife's longing, Michael secretly began gathering information about the child. One day, when he returned from work, he placed the documents on the table without preamble. Erin looked at him in surprise. "His name is Tommy, and he is at the baby home. He hasn't been adopted yet, but there are potential parents being vetted," he informed her. Erin eagerly grabbed the documents and frantically flipped through them, her lips trembling and tears filling her eyes as she read the words on the paper. "Tommy, my dear brother, how I would love to see you." The tenderness for her unknown baby overwhelmed her. She hugged her husband gratefully, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, my dear, for finding some information about him," she exclaimed, but she didn't dare ask the main question. Michael understood without words. "It won't be easy, but I promise you that I will do everything possible and impossible to bring him to us." Erin believed him as she always had. Now she knew exactly what she would wish for in the new year. Erin was awakened from her nostalgic memories. The birds had already had their breakfast and flown away, busy with their bird business. Outside, the children were playing joyfully, revelling in the large snowdrifts and the day off. With her pink cheeks, white jacket, and furry hat with ears, Mindy looked like a cute little animal. Her friend, the French bulldog, also dressed in a small dog coat, excitedly played nearby. Together they were building a huge snow cave. The sound of their happy laughter and the barking of the dog filled the neighbourhood. Meanwhile, the more serious and reserved Cooper skied around the area. Sitting on the railing, the big, important ginger cat observed everything condescendingly, not wanting to join in and get its paws wet. Erin stepped away from the window and leaned over the baby's crib. Tommy was peacefully asleep. He was so small and adorable. He had only recently returned to the family, yet it felt as if he had never left. Suddenly, Erin felt a fluttering sensation in her belly, like a little bird. She knew that another life was developing within her, another precious human being. A sense of tranquility and bliss washed over the young woman. Now that all her loved ones were close, she knew without a doubt that happiness resided in family.